You wake before the street does and light a pinch of resin on a shallow dish, the smoke curling like a cat that has learned manners. In the soft blue of the kitchen, you move toward the little niche where your house keeps its courage, the lararium, painted with tiny dancers and a pair of coiling serpents who look as if they're politely guarding the bread. You set a wreath of fresh leaves, pour 3 drops of wine, and whisper a greeting to the ones who live closest to your threshold, the Laras who keep watch, the Penates who mind the pantry, and the household genius, your home's invisible temperament, the way a room can feel friendly even when no one has said good morning yet. You don't shout. You don't need to. Daily rites are the empire's quiet grammar. A Roman household breathes in rhythms. A quick pinch of incense at dawn, a crumb of cake when ovens behave, a libation poured before travel or after safe return, a vow murmured at the lararium when the child's cough eases. Mainstream anchor to steady your hands. Most Roman homes had some form of domestic shrine, niches, wall paintings, or freestanding cupboards, where family members honored Laras and Penates with small offerings, garlands, and simple prayers. Digs at Pompeii and Herculaneum preserve dozens, often with painted serpents and miniature altars. You copy what your grandmother did with the serene confidence of someone who can cook from memory. You learn the personalities of these little gods by doing chores. A Lar is a guardian who likes clean thresholds. Sweep the stoop and you've already said a prayer. Penates are practical. They seem happiest when the pantry is stocked and the lids actually fit the jars. The household genius gets a birthday, dies Natalie's, and your family celebrates with a wreath on the lararium, a sweet libum set carefully on a plate, and a toast that tastes like gratitude. Quirky tidbit to tuck behind the amulets. Some families mark the genius's day as if the house itself were another relative, with a small procession around rooms and a cheerful insistence that even door hinges deserve a good omen. You keep the tools small. A ladle for the wine, a salt cellar for the mola salsa, that sacred pinch of salted meal that blesses as it touches, a twig of laurel to flick smoke gently. The motions matter more than the materials. Grand offerings are for public altars, not kitchen corners. Even so, your lararium can look festive. Bright ribbons on festival days. A small bronze Vesta when you have spare coin. Tiny lamps that throw respectful shadows. When you return from market with a clay lamp painted with a dolphin, you decide the Laras will enjoy the joke as much as your youngest does. Light joke 1. The boy asks if the dolphin will swim faster if you add more oil. You assure him the gods appreciate efficiency. You do not do this alone. A paterfamilias might lead the vows, but hands multiply the devotion. The mother of the house ties the wool fillet. The children carry the garland. The servant who minds the oven has a private way of nodding to the Penates when bread rises cleanly. Historians still argue whether domestic ritual leadership rested primarily with the male head or was shared fluidly among household members. Inscriptions and literary hints point both ways, with practice likely bending to circumstance, temperament, and the steady competency of the person nearest the hearth. Your experience says the house prefers whoever remembers to mend the wick. Outside your door, household piety joins neighborhood rhythm. At the Combita, crossroads shrines, you pay respects to the Laras of the quarter. On festival days you string little figurines or wool balls representing household members, a symbolic head count presented to the protectors who mind the boundaries between streets. You drop a small coin at the crossroads not because a law requires it but because custom makes the city feel sewn together. The young men brag about which alley's Lar is most effective. The old women know all the shrines by their cat populations. Your calendar follows this quiet work. On the calends, nones, and ides you freshen wreaths. During the Lemuria in May, you walk barefoot at night and toss black beans behind you 9 times, to placate restless spirits, and possibly to entertain the neighbors. You touch thresholds lightly, say names that only your family knows, and tie up the month with a nod that keeps the house brave. On wedding mornings, you change the garland, move the bride's dolls to make room for new ones, and promise the Penates that dinner will remain peaceful even with 2 grandmothers. Light joke too. Both grandmothers immediately promise the Penates the same, loudly, and the genius hides behind the lamp until dessert. Not every day is obedient. You spill wine, the lamp sputters, the dog steals the libum. Rites have their own elastic mercy. You tidy, relight, offer a crumb, and add a second pinch of incense with the secret thought that the gods also prefer second chances. You've heard the story, half warning, half comedy, of a man who muttered a vow so badly he had to start over with a new wreath and a cleaner conscience. Your house evolves the same rule. If you trip while blessing, you bless the stumble too. Domestic religion is not separate from civic life. It's the practice that lets you carry civic religion without dropping it. When a magistrate sacrifices on behalf of the city, he still goes home to a lararium. When Vestal virgins prepare the mola salsa for public rites, they are blessing a habit you've enacted all year with your own pinch of salt and flour. The Temple of Vesta, Rome's public hearth, makes your hearth feel seen. Your children like to imagine that the city's flame is just an enormous version of the lamp they aren't allowed to touch. The house also keeps a shelf for anxieties. Small amulets, bulla pendants for children, tooth charms, knotted cords, hang near the lararium, not as replacements for prayers but as daily companions to them. You consult a kitchen omen now and then. If the bread splits like a smile, guests will be agreeable. If the pot boils over, letters arrive, and then you laugh at yourself and wipe the stove. You keep a little bag with a bronze fascinus against the evil eye, half serious, half affectionate. A neighbor swears by a painted snake on the pantry wall. You swear by checking the jars before dark. The meaning of Laura's and Penates slides slightly under your fingers as you read. Historians still argue whether the Penates are strictly pantry gods, ancestors in disguise, or broader guardians of household prosperity. Ancient authors use the terms with a flexibility that suggests theology followed practice, not the other way around. Your own definitions are tactile. If it helps the house to feel sturdy, it probably counts. You offer to the same niche before travel, after childbirth, on the morning of exams, and when the roof finally stops leaking. The distinctions may matter in books. The gratitude does the job at home. Interlopers join politely across time. Your brother returns from service with a small figurine of Mithras. It sits on a side shelf like a guest who keeps good stories for evening. A friend who loves Isis leaves a blue ribbon that looks splendid on feast days. You tie it over the lararium later because you enjoy the color and the goddess's reputation for protection at sea, even if your closest water hazard is the courtyard fountain. Roman houses are generous curators. Imported devotions come in by way of relatives and neighbors, testing whether they make sense beside familiar faces. When Christianity begins to move through your street, the first change is a different grace at a familiar table. You end the day the way you began, 3 drops of wine, a whisper, a promise kept. You notice how the house pays you back. Fewer slammed doors, fewer missing keys, more patience with the way olives roll off plates. Light joke 3. You tell the law that if he can keep sandals from tangling in the doorway tomorrow, you will upgrade the lamp oil. You suspect he prefers the gesture to the grade. Mainstream fact to fold into your sleeve as you tidy the niche. Domestic piety, offerings to Laras, Penates, and the genius at household shrines, permeated Roman daily life across classes. With archaeological larvaria widespread in Pompeii/Herculaneum and literary references from Plautus to Pliny describing routine, offerings, vows, and family rites. The precise theology was less important than the continuity. Your hands learn what your neighbor's hands have always known. You keep the house brave with small, regular courtesies, and the house keeps you brave right back. You pinch the wick, let the smoke thin, and leave the niche as tidy as a sentence with a period. Tomorrow the calendar will wake again. Calends, market day, a cousin's visit, a letter to post, and you will cross the threshold twice, once for errands, once for thanks. The serpents on the wall look pleased. You take that as a good omen and go to sleep smelling faintly of laurel and bread. You step from your doorway right into the city's wider breadth, where religion wears sandals and keeps time. The Forum has its own pulse, set not by coin clatter but by an official calendar that feels as physical as paving stones. Priests, augurs, and the magistrates who borrow their language tell the day which clothes to wear, festival or law court, sacrifice or senate, and you learn to glance at notice boards the way sailors glance at sky. Painted letters say dies fastus, lawsuits aloud, or nefastus, don't even think about it. Processions stitch streets into sentences. The morning crier can cancel ambition with 4 words. The birds say no. You follow a line of boys carrying laurel boughs up the Capitoline slope, the air already salted with expectation. In a courtyard near the great temple, a priest in bright bordered tunic examines the calendar like a ship's captain at a harbor map. The pontifices, keepers of sacred law and date, have tuned the civic year to a rhythm of openings and careful silences, calends, nones, ides packed with rites, stern pauses where the gods are busy and mortals should not file petitions, festival crescendos when the whole city eats the same recipe for joy. Mainstream anchor to set beneath your sandals. The Pontifex Maximus and the College of Pontiffs maintained the fasti, calendars, controlled the addition of intercalary months in the Republic, supervised public cult, and advised magistrates. After Julius Caesar's reform, the Julian calendar, the year's arithmetic settled, but priestly custody of sacred days remained a civic metronome. Below the temple steps, a magistrate waits for the augur, because no one with a sash wants to anger the weather. Behind the weather, the augur arrives with his curved staff, the lituus, and marks a slice of sky like a patient tailor measuring a sleeve. He designates the templum, a ritual space in the air, and watches for signs, birds crossing left to right to left, thunder inconveniently auditioning in the east, the silence that means you should try again after lunch. If the signs please, the business of the day can begin. If not, Rome has a polite way of saying, "We meant to, but Jupiter coughed." Light joke 1. A clerk whispers that an augur is a man paid to watch birds. Another replies that he is a man paid to make senators watch birds, which is harder. You learn the other language of permission down where the altar throws gentle heat. Sacrifice is choreography more than spectacle, a procession with musicians who never tire of their 3 favorite notes. Victims crowned and dusted with mola salsa so the gods can smell the courtesy. right hands veiled when decorum insists, prayers spoken in a tempo that refuses to stumble. A perfectly clean cut, a quiet animal, a flame that catches on the first try, the city relaxes. Shoulders lower. Business can be business without the ceiling listening too hard. The haruspices, Etruscan in ancestry and unembarrassed about inspecting livers, sometimes step in as consultants, reading glossy lobes for texture and omen like gardeners who can diagnose a year by touching a leaf. The meat matters, divided with a justice that would please even accountants. The gods receive their share in fire, the city receives its share by appetite. The efficient takes the part tradition allows. The poor sometimes gather wisely at the edge of piety because religion has always known that stomachs have theology. Quirky tidbit to tuck into your ribbon basket. Priests sometimes wore caps fastened under the chin, those snug apex hats, so the sacred fillet stayed in place. A priest losing his cap mid-right counted as a bad sign, which is why one nervous young flameman became famous mostly for chin-strap diligence. Between altars and omens, time itself becomes ceremonial. You mark the Lupercalia by laughter and leather thongs briskly applied, the Saturnalia by caps reversed, gifts exchanged, and masters pretending to eat last. The Ludi Romani by horses that make courage look easy. On those days, officials speak less like officers and more like hosts. The gods are visible in how public space behaves. You notice that even skeptics keep the schedule because the schedule keeps the peace. Light joke 2. A shopkeeper swears he believes only in profit. Then he closes for the Perilia anyway because my sheep are traditionalists. Some offices braid politics with priesthood so tightly that you can't tell which thread is stronger. The Rex Sacrorum performs ancient rites that smell like the earliest stories. The Flamens of Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus carry rules that make them feel like living altars. No knots, no horses, no seeing an army on campaign because certain eyes must remain unworried. The Vestal Virgins tend the public flame with a steadiness that calms the entire city. Their bread of salted meal blesses other sacrifices. Their water must be fetched in silence. Their safety is the city's self-respect. Historians still argue whether these layers of taboo were primarily about purity, social signaling, or political insulation, were odd rules designed to preserve religious focus, to mark prestige, or to keep certain families crucially visible. The answer shifts with century and senate, but living inside the rules feels surprisingly practical. Make someone responsible for never blinking, and your calendar will stop tripping. You step into a Senate session that opens under good birds and an agreeable sacrifice. The augur's nod hangs over speeches like weather. When a tribune threatens veto, someone mentions a prodigy, statues sweating, a cow giving birth to something with too many legs, and suddenly the session adjourns to consult sibylline books. You learn that religion can be Rome's emergency brake and accelerator. Declare a prodigy, mandate a rite, reset the city's mood, and return with enough ceremony to excuse any delay. Light joke 3. A senator mutters that the gods are very convenient. His neighbor mutters that the gods consider the Senate equally so. Yours collect the technicalities that hold this all together. Auspices, auspicia, belong to magistrates. They take them when assuming office and before big acts, armies marching, assemblies voting. If they see something awkward, they can declare vidium, flaw, voiding the day like bakers tossing a burned batch. The pontiffs decide which days are fasti and nefasti, publish calendars, or don't, and advise on correct form when someone confuses a vow with a threat. The haruspices step in after prodigies, diagnose causes, prescribe rites. The result is a constitution with incense, rules so old they feel like instincts, and exceptions so practiced they feel like rules. You stand at a triumph and watch religion do politics without an apology. The general mounts the chariot, holds the laurel, and pretends to be a god for exactly long enough to return the pretense to Jupiter on the Capitol. The slaves whisper the famous reminder, "Remember you are mortal," and the city eats its way through the afternoon convinced that being mortal is currently acceptable. The laurel later becomes a wreath on the victor's doorway, which you recognize from your lararium at home. Public and private share cuttings, and both grow calmer. At the water's edge, you see how portable the whole system can be. A governor leaving for a province takes auspices at the harbor. A provincial altar appears in a town square 5 weeks later, smelling of home but hearing new languages. Local deities meet Roman forms in an improvisation that usually lands on something gracious. A Syrian goddess under a Latin name, a Celtic spring with a Roman dedication, a shared feast where everyone agrees the lamb was excellent and the omen friendly. The calendar brings Rome's spine. The local cults bring Rome's knees and wrists. Together they move. Mainstream fact to tuck in your sleeve before the procession ends. Augury, observation of birds and signs, was a recognized magistrate's prerogative and priestly discipline. Pontiffs maintained religious law and the calendar. Public sacrifices followed highly codified procedures with mola salsa, veiling, and victim examination. And prodigies led to senatorial consultations of the Sibylline books with expiatory rites ordered accordingly. The effect was not merely religious, but constitutional. Time and decision were governed with omen and rite as formal instruments. Of course, it phrase. An ambitious consul claims auspices wherever he stands. A stubborn augur fails to see inconvenient birds. Crowds interpret prodigies as editorial cartoons. Yet the habit persists because it suits a city that dislikes abruptness. Rites slow the pulse, omens give exits, calendars give excuses, and excuses, properly blessed, are Rome's favorite medicine. By dusk, the augur closes his lituous case with a click that sounds like a door politely shut. You walk home past altars cooling in their dignity and a notice board where tomorrow already has a label, and you understand why your house's small rites fit so neatly into this larger grammar. Both are ways of telling time kindly. You hang your laurel at the lararium, blow ash from the lamp, and feel the city settle into the good night of a day that had permission. The birds will be there in the morning. You plan to listen, and also to make coffee, because even in Rome, omens improve with breakfast. You cross a provincial forum at mid-morning and feel a different kind of warmth. Sun on stone, yes, but also a civic affection trained to face a particular direction. The altar in front of you isn't for Jupiter or a local river. It's for the emperor's genius, the bright fiction of his presence that towns adopt the way families adopt a house spirit. You've been lighting your lararium at home, Section 1. Here the city lights its own, scaled up and set where speeches echo. The effect is gentle gravity. You don't feel forced. You feel oriented. Walk the perimeter and read the promises baked into columns. Inscriptions thank an emperor for a road, a harbor, a tax remission that spared a harvest from becoming an anecdote. Priests in neat fillets rehearse a modest procession. A wreath waits on the altar. A tablet with the date of the emperor's birthday, Dies Natalis, leans against a column like a reminder to bring cake. mainstream anchor to keep your sandals steady. From Augustus onward, the cultus of the emperor, honoring his genius and later deified predecessors, became a standard feature of provincial civic life. Formal provincial assemblies, koina in the Greek East, concilia in the Latin West, maintained temples to Roma and the emperor, elected priests, and organized festivals that stitched local pride to imperial loyalty without demanding theology, just gratitude and habit. Notice how the emperor arrives without arriving. In the East, cities blend older habits with the new grammar. A temple to Roma and Augustus shares the skyline with a shrine to a local patron. Statues of the emperor stand near gods in the theater precinct as if waiting for their cues. In the West, altars bloom along roads like milestones that congratulate you for still being in the empire. Governors preside. Town elites sponsor. Choirs learn odes that age well because they're mostly about peace and fountains. Historians still argue whether provincial emperor worship was primarily political, a loyalty ritual, social, an elite networking tool, or devotional for real, a sincere sacred habit. The paperwork votes for politics. The festivals feel like both friendship and weather insurance. You sit on a stoop and watch a priest of the imperial cult practice his lines. He is not a wizard. He is a civic uncle with good posture. When he sacrifices, he names the emperor's health, the safety of the legions, the prosperity of the town. The prayer sounds like a maintenance schedule. The crowd nods because a healthy emperor means unexciting taxes, roads that get repaired, and pirates that remain anecdotes. Light joke 1. A vendor hawks figs. Dedicated to imperial patience. Larger, he claims, because the emperor's gaze encourages agriculture. You buy 2 and discover patience tastes like sugar. Step into a provincial koinon meeting, an assembly of cities who have learned to speak in chorus. Delegates argue about where to hold the next games in honor of the emperor, which priest gets the annual crown, how many bulls count as gratitude rather than flattery. The minutes read like politics done with wreaths. The benefit is practical. Cities that coordinate praise also coordinate petitions, remissions after earthquakes, funds for harbors, permission to rewrite a charter so it fits the century. The imperial cult becomes a switchboard. You call to sing, you stay to solve problems. There is a posture to the altars themselves. In Gaul, a great altar at Lugdunum, Lion, gathers the tribes into one place, a monumental promise carved in stone that we belong. In Asia Minor, smooth marble and Greek epigraphy make loyalty look old-fashioned on purpose. Rome likes borrowing longevity. In North Africa, votive dedications pair local prosperity with the emperor's title and a duet the wind can read. You walk through all of them and sense the same design, local faces facing the same sun. The cult's gentlest trick is how it travels into daily life without shouting. Guilds hold a shared meal for the emperor's safety, which also nicely funds a new roof for the guild hall. Veterans light a yearly wreath before sharing wine that is more about memory than policy. A city festival in the emperor's name includes races, music, and a public distribution of bread. Nobody minds that the dedication on the loaves includes the imperial titles. Flour has always been good at diplomacy. Quirky tidbit to slip into your sleeve. In some towns, miniature altars to the emperor's genius appeared in shops and workshops the way you might hang a patron's portrait. Little stone companions that turn ordinary business into a polite nod toward the center. A barber in one inscription calls himself Sacerdos Augusti, priest of Augustus, on weekends and charges the same price as on weekdays. which proves that loyalty may be sacred but hair still grows at an economic rate. The imperial cult is also a stage for local elites. Priesthoods rotate through families who can afford the expenses. Sacrifices aren't cheap, and games cost more, and the honor becomes a resume line you can smell. A man who has worn the crown of the provincial priesthood can knock on a governor's door with less throat clearing. Historians still argue whether this turned religion into a subsidy for oligarchies or turned oligarchies into servants of civic piety. The evidence suggests both. Generosity bought applause and, more importantly, continuity. In Rome proper, the tone tilts towards ceremony with an edge of policy. The Senate votes consecratio for deceased emperors it approves of, puffing them gently into divi and giving their successors permission to call themselves son of a god. Augustus choreographs the dance so well that later emperors barely have to learn the steps. Caligula improvises and discovers that improvisation has a short shelf life. You watch a funeral column carry an emperor toward apotheosis and notice how smoke, rhetoric, and relief blend into a single script. The city likes giving its endings good endings. The hard paradox is obvious and weirdly untroubling. The emperor is a man, but honor him like more than a man. The emperor is mortal, but treat his genius as a civic weather vane. When he dies and the Senate approves, he joins a polite heaven where politics cannot subpoena him. Regular people reconcile this the way they reconcile household rights, by doing what works. If lighting a lamp to the emperor's welfare makes the tax collector kinder, and the bridge timely, the lamp earns its oil. Sometimes the glue hardens too visibly. A governor uses the imperial cult to demand enthusiasm. A city uses it to outpraise a rival. A priesthood becomes a political cudgel. Other times the glue keeps a crack from widening. An earthquake hits, and the emperor's priest organizes relief faster than the council because the temple has grain and candles. A frontier town needs morale, and an imperial festival turns into a hiring fair for road repairs and a clinic for gossip. The usefulness keeps the ritual warm. You hear the first quiet dissonances as other devotions rise. A synagogue refuses incense to a human figure and pays a tax instead. Rome accepts the math because stability is valuable. Later, a Christian workshop bows out of the emperor's image offerings while still praying for the emperor's health in their own assembly. The city notices the difference and raises one eyebrow before going back to weighing fish. The imperial cult's strength, its political flexibility, buys time for these new sentences to find their grammar. You feel the hinge turning without creaking, yet, light joke too, a poet reads an ode in honor of the emperor that includes a line about your immortality, then coughs and edits it mid-recitation to your moral mortality, which earns him both safety and a small reputation for cleverness. The priest later says the gods have a sense of humor about adjectives. The material culture leaves clues that make archaeologists smile. Coin types pair the emperor with pax, securitas, eternitas. Abstract friends turned into women with good posture, so that money can spend logic as well as buying power. Altars carved with oak wreaths, corona civica, claim the emperor. Save citizens, a sentence that gets stamped into memory every time a passerby reads it while waiting for a friend. Provincial temple ruins keep their stairs even when their roofs are rumors. You can still stand on them and feel how gratitude likes altitude. Mainstream fact to tuck in next to your notebook. The imperial cult's institutions, provincial councils, priesthoods, temples to Roma et Augustus, flourished especially in the Greek East, e.g., at Pergamon, Smyrna, Ephesus, and at Lugdunum in Gaul. Honors included annual games, altars, and priestly crowns. Dead emperors judged worthy were deified by senatorial decree, and living emperors received vows for their salus, health, and victory, without formal deification. The cult never required personal metaphysics. It required good manners. By late afternoon, the wreath has been burned, the bulls carved into shares, and the forum smells like a picnic that's studied hard. You notice the intangible residue. Letters will be answered faster this week. The governor will smile more. The Veterans Club will get its stipend without a footnote. Light joke 3. A child asks whether the emperor eats his share from the smoke. His mother says the emperor eats from taxes and the gods from gratitude. The child decides both diets work. You walk home along a road edged with small altars, each a mile or so apart, and feel the empire's most persuasive argument. You belong to a story that is larger than the next harvest but close enough to bless it. The emperor's face on a coin is one kind of promise. His genius on an altar is another. Together they turn distance into familiarity. Tomorrow you'll watch other devotions gather their people, and the harmony will start to change key. For tonight the glue holds, polite, practiced, and sticky in all the right places. You drift into a square that feels like a living room big enough for weather. The flagstones are swept. Vendors have learned the choreography of not being in the way. Somewhere a flute practices the three-note melody Romans apparently never got tired of. Temples stand like older relatives, familiar and quietly opinionated, facing each other across the traffic of errands and oaths. You've saluted your Lauras at home, Section 1, watched augurs lend the sky to politics, Section 2, and nodded at the emperor's genius and provincial stone, Section 3. Here, religion becomes public service with seating, processions, games, and the architecture of belonging. You begin with steps, the kind that climb and the kind that are counted. Temple stairs are invitations disguised as exercise. Up you go to the high porch, where columns think in straight lines and shadows behave. The priest emerges with a fillet that refuses to slip. The incense bowl makes a small cloud that tastes like law, and the doorway frames the image inside like a slow wink. Mainstream anchor to set on the threshold. Temples were not just god houses but civic treasuries and meeting places. Many held state records, storehouses, or city funds, e.g., the aerarium under Saturn's temple, and festivals tied to those temples distributed meat, staged games, and reset social clocks. Processions stitched the streets into one long sentence, punctuation provided by drums and elbows. A pampa, that gorgeous parade preceding games, moves with a composure you don't see on market day. Priests in order, sacrificial animals garlanded, statues of gods paraded on shoulders or in carts, boys with laurel, girls with baskets, magistrates pretending their shoes don't pinch. On corners, tiny shrines get a nod. At the crossroads, the Lauras of the neighborhood receive a smile as if to say, "Yes, we still live here." Light joke 1. A flute player's dog trots alongside with the exact solemnity of a person who knows the route better than the magistrate. The point is not only looking, it's eating, hearing, sharing shade. When a sacrifice finishes, the god's share hurries up through smoke and the city's share travels toward grills and platters. Distribution is ritual mathematics. Certain cuts for officials, some for the priesthood, much for the gathered people. A temple's precinct becomes a picnic with rules. Benches appear. Salt and jokes circulate. Small quarrels dissolve under the pleasant authority of a man holding a carving knife. You've seen how household rites domesticate worry. Here public rites domesticate crowds. Games, Ludi sealed the promise. In the circus, you learn to shout without malice. In the theater, you learn that comedy thinks better when the audience has eaten. The Ludi Romani honor Jupiter with horses that make dust look patriotic. The Ludi Megalenses honor the Great Mother with plays that giggle in Greek accents. The Floralia throws petals and a wink. Historians still argue whether the games began primarily as sacred obligations with entertainment attached or as entertainment ennobled by sacred cover. The chicken and the egg keep trading costumes, but their effect is unambiguous. They syndicate good mood. A city that laughs together spends the next morning kinder at scales. Walk the porticos. They are temple-side conversations, long shaded corridors where lawyers whisper, schoolmasters recite, and idle friends perform the serious art of leaning. In summer, porticos save public life from the sun. In winter, they turn drizzle into something almost decorative. Reliefs and inscriptions along the walls make history legible between errands, a donor's name, a miracle's rumor, a municipal promise to repair a roof before the next festival. Quirky tidbit. Some porticos had painted program boards, think ancient bulletin boards, where the order of events, names of charioteers, or the day's singers were chalked in and smudged out with the endearing chaos of any public schedule. Temples coordinate calendars with a tenderness that looks like control. The morning sacrifice cues shops to lift shutters. A noontime hymn makes even cynical clerks pause mid-tally. Evening lamps on altars tell the street it may land the day now. You notice the small kindness of water basins at entrances, cooling wrists before petitions, giving children an excuse to be quiet. You also notice how festivals redecorate space. Garlands over statues, colored awnings between columns, ribbons that make stone look freshly awake. Below the music, administration hums. Aediles check weights under temple eaves because judgment prefers shade. Record chests sit inside certain sanctuaries because priests sleep lightly. City funds are stored in rooms that are sacred because fear of lightning makes thieves reconsider. Mainstream fact to pin to the coffer. The Temple of Saturn in Rome housed the aerarium, state treasury, in the Republic. Other temples stored municipal archives, treaties, and bronze tablets of laws, religion lending architecture and awe to paperwork. The festivals carry social terms and conditions that rarely need to be said out loud. On Saturnalia, masters play at being servants and the city pretends hierarchy has a hinge. On Parentalia, families visit tombs and the streets walk softer. On Comitalia, neighborhoods honor crossroads lauras and eat as if gossip were sacrament. The city reassigns its corners. Places where you haggle become places where you sing. Light joke 2. A usually grim baker decorates his loaves with little faces during the Ludi cereals and insists the god prefers bread that smiles back. You see why new cults migrate into this habit like birds finding a roof line. When Isis sails into town, her festival borrows processions and music and adds boat-scented perfumes and linen that moves like water. When Mithras gathers soldiers underground, the city above still marks his public days with a discreet garland on a donative plaque. When Christians begin to assemble in halls at first borrowed, then built, they learn to time alms and feasts to the civic calendar's appetite for shared meals. Shared space teaches new languages to conjugate courtesy. Temples themselves are less aloof than their profiles suggest. On non-festival days, a mother brings her child to touch a column and whisper a petition. A merchant stops by to promise an offering if a risky shipment arrives. A sailor hangs a tiny model ship to thank a goddess for a storm that chose someone else. You watch a priest set aside a cracked statue of foot that someone left as a vow, a plaster ex voto in the shape of what needed mending. The steps become a shelf for hopes with labels. Then there are the practical jokes the city plays on itself in the name of order. A procession route doubles as street cleaning plan. Bystanders tidy because the god is coming and because the neighbors are watching. A temple portico becomes a temporary shelter during a sudden downpour. Within minutes, someone starts singing a festival hymn even if the calendar disagrees, and the give of laughter keeps the rain from feeling like a verdict. The public learns to be a congregation that can form and dissolve without instructions. Historians still argue whether festivals were primarily tools of elite management, bread, circuses, and polished consent, or whether they were genuine negotiations of meaning between rulers and ruled. Your shoes tell you the argument is a false choice when you're standing under a garland. Yes, elites pay and preen. Yes, people eat and cheer. In between, a city learns its own choreography, how to stand together, how to break apart without sulking, how to let an altar make a corner feel safe. You circle back to the circus where the track smells like grass and wagers. A charioteer's team clatters past in practice, and everyone swears they can already tell who will win because prophecy is legal if it's about horses. Vendors chant. Children insist the blues are kinder than the greens. An old man says he remembers a time when the reds mattered. The starting gates creak like old jokes. Even this, somehow, is religion adjacent. Vows made to the gods if a favorite wins, thanks offered afterward in coins that cost less than a burnt offering but count just as much in the mind. By late afternoon, the temple steps have cooled into pews. You sit with a cup of watered wine and watch the city do its tidying. Garlands down, awnings folded, a priest carefully wrapping the fillet for tomorrow. You think of your lararium and the way your house learned its courtesies from these bigger rooms. The same logic holds. Small rituals keep little rooms brave. Grand rituals keep large rooms kind. Light joke 3. A boy asks if the god sleeps in the cell at night. The priest smiles and says the god sleeps wherever people behave. The boy promises to behave in the bakery if the god likes pastry. Mainstream aside to bring home with the dusk. Temples anchored civic memory and function. Festivals, religious in origin, were integrated into municipal budgets and calendars. Processions and games made piety visible and edible, and public religious spaces doubled as the city's shelters for law, records, and shade. The result isn't piety as sermon, it's piety as infrastructure. You descend the steps, brush your hand along a column cool as reason, and walk out into a street that smells faintly of ash and honey. The portico's shadow follows you a little way, like a blessing wearing sandals. Behind you, a janitor sweeps the last of the petals into a wicker basket. Ahead, someone is already hanging tomorrow's ribbon. You decide you don't need an omen to know that the city will be here in the morning, ready to be good at being together again. You wander a street where shop signs speak more languages than your pantry has jars, and you realize the city likes its gods the way cooks like stews. Start with a base, add something fragrant from next door, let the flavors get friendly. A corner shrine shows Hermes, yes, but the locals keep calling him Mercury and swearing he prefers honeyed wine. Across the lane a small altar to Zeus looks very much like Jupiter wearing a Greek beard he forgot to shave. You've seen how public cult runs on calendars and courtesy, sections 2 to 4. Now you watch religion do what markets have always done: trade, borrow, rename, and set out samples. Begin at the docks, where cranes creak and sailors greet statues the way veterans greet old boots. On one pier you find a neat little sanctuary to Isis, Egyptian in origin, Mediterranean in ambition, her headdress rising like a crescent boat, her priests in linen that catches the wind. Next to her, a plaque to Serapis smiles with that cosmopolitan calm only a deliberately invented god can wear. Mainstream anchor to keep your sandals sure. In the Hellenistic and Roman periods, deities traveled with merchants and soldiers. Isis and Serapis spread from Egypt across the Mediterranean, with major cult centers in places like Delos, Puteoli, Rome's Campus Martius, and beyond. Rome did not so much erase local gods as translate them, identifying Greek Zeus with Jupiter, Artemis with Diana, Ares with Mars, and so on, while also hosting Anatolian, Syrian, and Phrygian cults that kept their accents. You step into a precinct of the Great Mother, Magna Mater Cybele, whose stone from Pessinus sailed to Rome during a crisis centuries ago, and has been receiving drums, prayers, and side-eye ever since. The Gali priests beat time with cymbals. The procession moves like weather with a plan. Respectable matrons leave offerings because a goddess who mothers the mountain can surely mind a townhouse. A boy asks if the lions on her chariot are well fed. The priest says they are allegorical. The boy looks relieved but still hides his sandwich. Light joke 1. You consider telling the boy that allegories don't eat bread, only metaphors, but decide to let grammar rest. Around the corner, an Anatolian goddess gets a Latin caption and a Greek hymn, and nobody worries that she answers to 3 names as long as she answers. A Syrian Atargatis smiles from a fish-scented court. A local river god leans on an urn and pretends he has always known her. The pairing is not conquest, it is neighbors borrowing flour. Historians still argue whether syncretism was primarily top-down policy, imperial convenience smoothing provincial edges, bottom-up practice, ordinary people mixing devotions that worked, or a philosophical hobby of elites who loved harmonizing pantheons. Yours vote for all 3. Governors sponsor temples that speak 2 languages. Dockworkers stitch charms from whichever goddess answers storms. And poets write smug epigrams proving that all gods are one if you squint politely. You visit a Greek-style temple where Dionysus keeps a Roman cellar. The priest offers a cup and an explanation. The god frees you from fear for exactly 1 evening so you can return to your duties in the morning. Also, the wine is local because import fees are a kind of impiety. The mask on the wall grins like a friend who knows your better stories. A theater troupe rehearses in the portico, half prayer and half payroll. You toast with a sip and promise the lararium at home you will eat before making any vows. Light joke 2. A chorus member tells you the god invented hangovers to keep priests in business. The priest nods gravely and asks for a donation. Across town, a small Mithraeum hides behind a respectable doorway and under a respectable floor. You descend into the cave where soldiers shake off dust and ranks, and you learn the grades like a secret recipe: raven, bridegroom, soldier, lion, Persian, sunrunner, father, each with a test, a meal, and a memory. The Tauroctony relief. Mithras pinning a cosmic bull, glows in lamplight. The stars sit in carved niches. Bread and cup move hand to hand in a fellowship that makes garrisons feel like families. Quirky tidbit to place by the lamp. Some Mithraea painted the ceiling as a night sky with zodiac signs, so initiates dined beneath constellations they could never afford as jewelry. You climb back into sun and notice the ground-level Temple of Sol Invictus across the street winking like a cousin. You keep turning corners and bump into household shrines that have learned new grammar. A shopkeeper's lararium now includes a little bronze of Anubis. He swears the jackal-headed god is excellent with invoices. A potter props a figurine of Aphrodite beside Venus and swears both improved his glaze. The city looks less like a pantheon and more like a market of introductions. A new god rarely arrives alone. She brings recipes, music, perfumes, and favorite colors that stain festivals delightfully. Philosophers, being philosophers, try to tidy the stew into a thesis. A Stoic merchant explains that names differ but nature is one. A Platonist adds that the many gods point toward the good the way shadows point toward a lamp. An Epicurean smirks and says the gods are distant, kindly, and uninterested in your shopping list. Meanwhile, your neighbor puts a wreath on a statue because the rent money finally arrived, and you notice how theology and gratitude can sit at the same table without arguing about verbs. Syncretism learns politics easily. Provincial priests of the imperial cult, Section 3, sprinkle honors to the emperor into festivals of local gods. Local councils rename a spring, Augusta, and receive a road. A governor funds a temple whose inscription thanks both him and a Syrian goddess for safe harvests, which is fair because the goddess watered and the governor did not tax rain. Over time, names accrete like barnacles in 3 languages, and the altar looks like a resume. You trace the letters with a finger and decide that a god with many names is like a ship with many ropes, more to hold, fewer sudden swims. You ask how ordinary people switch between deities without feeling disloyal, and an old woman tells you the story of bread. You bake with wheat, but you still bless barley when barley keeps you through spring. Loyalty, in other words, is gratitude's memory, not jealousy dressed as piety. She shows you her wrist charm. Isis is not beside a tiny bronze phallus to fend off the evil eye, and then flicks your ear for laughing because safety is not embarrassed. Light joke 3. You apologize to her charm in case it keeps a list. Yet the stew has edges. Synagogues keep Sabbath without incense to human figures. They pray for emperors' welfare but do not gild their statues. Later, Christian gatherings will bless bread and cup with fierce concentration and increasingly refuse festival garlands that smell like other gods. The shared street begins to host gentle disagreements about what counts as courtesy and what counts as compromise. For a while, habit holds. A Christian ship captain still pays harbor fees at an altar he does not adore. A Jewish baker sells loaves for Saturnalia without singing the songs. Then, as numbers shift and patronage changes addresses, temples notice their crowds thinning and their roofs aging faster than inscriptions. Mainstream aside to keep in your sleeve, inscriptions and archaeology show intense blending. Interpretatio Romana equating deities, Jupiter/Zeus, Mars/Ares, cross-Mediterranean growth of Isis/Serapis cults. Anatolian Cybele/Magna Mater in Rome since the Second Punic War, Syrian/Phrygian deities in western towns, widespread Mithria associated with soldiers and officials, alongside persistent distinct communities, Jews with protected status, later Christians defining themselves against idols. The city remains multilingual in worship until imperial favor starts speaking Latin and Greek with a bishop's cadence. You end the afternoon at a harbor festival for Isis, the Navigium Isidis, where a painted boat on wheels sails down a street under a sky that looks like a fresh amphora. Priests sprinkle water like a joke and a blessing. Sailors lift hands hardened by rope. Vendors sell little terracotta boats, that children will float in basins until terracotta proves its limitations. You watch a Christian woman on a doorstep cross herself quietly and a sailor touch his forehead to the passing prow. Nobody frowns because the wind is kind this season and gratitude has never minded company. Historians still argue whether syncretism softened later conflicts by habituating cities to layered identities or sharpened them by making final refusals. No incense here, no garland there. Feel like treason to street custom. Your feet whisper the answer civically. Mixture kept peace until power changed. The moment when imperial patronage moved from altars to churches, and names that had cohabited politely began to compete for roofs and subsidies. By dusk, you've collected the day's flavors on your sleeve. A smear of incense from an Egyptian hall. Flour from a Greek baker who swears Demeter still checks his scales. And dust from a Phrygian drum that vibrates longer than it sounds. You carry home a ribbon dyed the blue of river gods and tie it on the lararium not as a conquest but as a souvenir. The serpents on the wall look intrigued rather than offended, which is how you know your house understands the city. Names are many, thresholds are few, and gratitude tastes the same in 3 languages. You travel on foot and in rumor, following a road that tastes of olives and old vows. The hills open, the sea glints like a polite confidant, and Eleusis waits, either far from Athens nor entirely in this world. You've moved through Rome's busy calendar, sections 2 to 4, and browsed its syncretic market of gods, section 5. Now you approach a cult that keeps a secret like a lamp keeps a flame, not to hoard light, but to share it safely. You are here for grain and for the kind of story that makes winter feel like a hallway rather than a wall. The prologue is older than politics. Demeter searching for Persephone, the earth's hunger learning it has seasons, grief learning that bargains can have flowers. At Eleusis the tale is not read, it is walked. You begin in Athens with the lesser mysteries at Agrai, purifications in springtime. Then, months later, you join the great autumn procession along the sacred way. Your feet and the river Ilissos make friends. Torches are lifted, jokes are legal, and alarmingly earthy, and an old woman's coarse humor near the bridge accomplishes in 5 lines what sermons take an hour to do: cleanse the air by laughter. Light joke 1. A fellow initiate whispers that Demeter herself approved of good timing and better punchlines. You whisper back that gods who invented grain also invented snacks. Mainstream anchor to pin to your sash. The Eleusinian mysteries, centered at Eleusis near Athens, were among the most famous initiation cults of the ancient world, open, with modest exclusions, to Greeks and later Romans. Candidates went through preliminary purifications, lesser mysteries, then in the month Bodromian. Joined processions, fasts, sacrifices, and nocturnal rites culminating in the Telesterion, the great hall where initiates received a vision or things shown, Dagnimina, things said, Legomena, and things done, Dramina. The promise was blessedness now and a kinder fate after death. The emblem was grain that dies and returns. You fast lightly, barley water, small restraint, and feel how an empty edge sharpens attention. At the sea you wash, not to become stainless but to become sincere. In the sanctuary you hand over a piglet for sacrifice, which makes you consider how closely food and holiness hold hands. The Hierophant, High Revealer, belongs to a family that has kept these passwords alive longer than certain city walls. His voice enters the Telesterion like a key entering a lock. The Deduchos, torchbearer, makes darkness feel constructive rather than unfriendly. The great hall swallows you and your cleverness together, and you are grateful. What happens inside is the most famous thing you're not allowed to talk about. Not because fear hisses, but because precision cannot travel without breaking. Later writers hint at a sheaf of wheat displayed in sudden bright light, at a sacred winnowing fan, lignon, at silent objects revealed, at a cry, hi kai, that is half riddle, half rain spell. You remember your Lararium's patient rituals and realize Eleusis acts like a magnifying glass. Small gestures you can hold become a vision you cannot. Historians still argue whether the climactic epiphany involves stagecraft, a blaze of light revealing sacred objects, a dramatic reenactment of Persephone's return, a taste of a potion that altered mood, or a carefully orchestrated combination. Our sources are suggestive, contradictory, and frustrating in the precise way secrets wish to be. You do know this much. The drink, the Kikian, tastes peasant honest, barley, water, pennyroyal, and carries a whisper of fields. Quirky tidbit to place on your tongue. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, the goddess asks for Kikian instead of wine, a rustic potion that makes a kind of theological sense. Grain humbled into drink, blessing grain raised into bread. Some moderns nudge and wonder whether ergot on barley ever lent visions. You, having tasted many a stern porridge, suspect choreography did most of the lifting and the human capacity for shared awe did the rest. Initiation is not a single thunderclap. It is a layered weather. The procession's laughter, the fast quiet, the salt sting, the torches tunnels, the moment inside where a thing shown becomes a thing believed, all stack into a calm that proves more durable than surprise. You exit like someone who has finally understood an old family story. The promise you carry home is not, you will not die. It is, you will walk that hallway with a lamp and with friends. Eleusis makes winter morally intelligible. The cult's policy impresses you as much as its poetry. Barring infamous crimes, the mysteries were open to men and women, enslaved and free alike. Status dilutes at the threshold the way smoke dilutes in night air. Romans came eagerly. Emperors protected the rights. Philosophers, even skeptical ones, spoke with respect about things seen. Mainstream aside to keep. Cicero calls the mysteries the greatest of Athens's gifts, granting not only a way to live but sweeter hopes for dying. Later emperors like Hadrian patronized Eleusis. The families of the Eumolpidi and Charax maintained hereditary roles, and the Telesterion grew monumental under Pericles and later restorations. Inside the sanctum, objects matter because stories need handles. A chest, kist, may hold the goddess's tokens. A stalk of grain may be lifted at exactly the right breadth of the hall. A reenacted finding of Persephone may align the crowd's heartbeat. You do not become a different species. You become a person whose errands have an aftertaste. Your bread at breakfast now leans toward blessing by habit. Your griefs, you have some, acquire the dignity of seasons rather than the tyranny of clocks. Light joke too. An initiate friend tells you he now waters his figs as if Persephone herself might grade him. You tell him the goddess loves figs but hates overwatering. He writes this down as if it were scripture. You watch someone you don't like very much emerge from the Telesterion smiling in a way that disarms you. Eleusis manages the social miracle of making old quarrels look out of fashion. Not because the gods enforce niceness, but because shared secrecy levels the room. In a society that adores status, a night where no one's title buys a better view functions like a reset button. Politics minds its manners here. When wars trample Attica, Eleusis is sometimes spared or swiftly repaired. Even harsh reformers step lightly. Later, When Christians and emperors begin declining the old gods' invitations, the sanctuary lingers in memory like a song that takes longer to fade because it was learned in childhood. Historians still argue whether the mystery's decline was due primarily to Theodosius's late 4th century edicts, to the Gothic sack under Alaric. Tradition says the sanctuary burned, to a shrinking pool of patrons, or to a cultural pivot that gradually unhooked winter from Persephone and attached it to other calendars. Ashes tell one story, silence tells another. What you keep returning to is grain as teacher. You had met gods who managed war, sea, thunder. Here a god manages bread, and therefore everything. Sowing is faith, burial with intention. Germination is resurrection that refuses to be metaphor only. Harvest is gratitude that tastes like work. Eleusis does not cancel grief, it seasons it. This is not philosophy's syllogism. It is kitchen theology. Mix flour with water, let time pass, bake, share. Pilgrimage, too, leaves a civic footprint you can smell. Inns thrive in autumn. Vendors sell wreaths the size of promises. Choruses practice hymns that feel like muscle memory. Road markers along the sacred way learn to stand straighter. A city that hosts hope beats a little better. You think of Rome's Annona, Section 12, grain as policy, and realize Eleusis' grain as metaphysics. The state feeds bodies. This feeds the courage to keep bodies fed. Your sense of the gods shifts a half step. At home, the Laras respond to tidiness. In the Forum, Jupiter responds to schedules. At Eleusis, Demeter and Persephone respond to patience. You decide that patience might be the least flashy virtue and the most useful. The mysteries whisper that the earth is not stingy but cyclical, not capricious but sometimes negotiating custody. You tuck that sentence under your pillow like a receipt for spring. Quirky image to store against lean days. Initiates returning home with a sprig of myrtle and a little bundle. Perhaps a measure of barley. Perhaps a token. Walking more slowly than they left, as if checking that their shadows were still the right size. Another. The Iacchus cry. Half hymn, half cheer. Bubbling from a crowd at dusk, torches bobbing like constellations that got curious and descended to street height. By the time you reach your doorway, the smell of smoke has turned friendly again. You lay a tiny loaf at your lararium and say nothing more ambitious than, "Thank you." The serpents on the wall seem to incline their painted heads as if recognizing a fellow craftsperson, a shrine that teaches endurance. Light joke 3. You promise the Penates you will not turn every meal into a sermon. They seem skeptical but willing to negotiate if dessert is involved. Mainstream fact to carry forward. The Eleusinian mysteries endured for centuries, drawing initiates from across the Mediterranean. The Telesterion was an immense hall for nocturnal rites. Classes and genders mixed within certain bounds. Secrecy was both sacral law and social glue, and the rites offered, not immortality in the modern sense, but Eulabia, reverent caution, and Macaria, a blessed prospect, concerning death. The ritual center was Demeter's grief healed by Persephone's return, enacted as vision rather than sermon. You sleep that night with a new courtesy toward your kitchen. Bread in the morning will not only be breakfast, it will be a small Eleusis reenacted with butter. Winter will come as it does, but you will count it like a responsible treasurer of days, and spring will reply. And in the middle of summer in 6 months from now, you will see a field with new green and feel the telesterion open briefly inside your chest. Silence, torchlight, sheaf, and the soft applause of soil learning again how to lift. You follow the smell of salt and resin to a quay where ships nap like crocodiles and ropes make their slow arguments with wood. A linen banner moves as if it remembers being water. Somewhere a sistrum, the bronze rattle with the voice of summer, shakes 3 patient syllables into the air. You've walked Eleusis and learned how a secret can teach courage, Section 6. Now you step into a cult that travels with sailors and shopkeepers, stitches harbors to bedrooms, and promises protection in the tone of a mother who has done this before. Isis does not ask you to be clever. She asks you to come aboard. The procession begins where the street becomes tide. Priests in crisp linen, clean in a way that makes you want to apologize to your tunic, bear a small boat on their shoulders, a model hull painted with ibis and palm. The god's image rides shaded. The crowd follows with a seriousness that has room for smiles. You hear snatches of Egyptian-sounding hymns braided into Greek phrases the city can hum. Incense leans seaward as if it, too, were thinking of departure. Mainstream anchor to tie to a bollard, the cult of Isis, born in Egypt and Hellenized through Ptolemaic centuries, spread widely across the Mediterranean under the early empire, flourishing in port cities from Alexandria and Delos to Puteoli, Ostia, and Rome's Campus Martius. Initiations, processions like the Navigium Isidis, launching the sailing season, and daily temple services tended by shaven, linen-clad priests made Isis a familiar foreigner. You watch the high priest draw water with a silver ladle, then sprinkle the boat and the front ranks of the crowd. The gesture is both blessing and joke. The sea will have its say, but let's begin in good temper. A sailor touches his forehead. A fishmonger touches his basket. A mother touches her child's hair so that the salt will remember to be gentle. Light joke 1. A bored teenager stands too close and gets enthusiastically sprinkled. He announces that he now feels officially waterproof, and his grandmother tells him to thank the goddess before he tests the claim. Inside the temple precinct, coolness has been installed professionally. Painted walls show Nile landscapes with birds that look like handwriting. Columns carry floral capitals that pretend stone learned to bloom. A priestess swings the sistrum, up, down, a soft clatter like fine rain on bronze. The god appears in many moods, Isis nursing Horus like a quiet thunderbolt of comfort, Isis Fortuna holding a rudder, Isis Sothis wearing a starry crown that schedules the year. You realize this is a grammar of usefulness, mother, pilot, calendar. Your house gods keep thresholds, Section 1. Isis keeps departures. You pay attention to the household version because that is where religion pays rent. A small Isis figurine sits on a shelf beside a Roman lararium. In one home, she shares space with Venus and a cameo of a grandfather who survived a bad storm because 3 sailors remembered the hymn, and 1 remembered the rope. A woman shows you an Isis knot amulet, looped like patience, tied to her linen chemise. She says it secures more than cloth. Quirky tidbit for your pocket, the Isis knot, a distinctive tie in garments and amulets, appears often in art and archaeology. Women wore it as a protective charm, and some Roman funerary portraits from Egypt painted in bright red as if protection preferred to be conspicuous. Skeptics show up and are fed politely. A philosopher peers at the animal-headed gods and pronounces an allegory. A Stoic hears, "Mother of the cosmos," and drafts a lecture about providence. An Epicurean says the Nile's flood explains itself and asks only that the priests keep the temple fountains open to the public. Meanwhile, your neighbor prays for her brother's safe voyage and leaves a clay model of a foot as a vow because ankles, too, need supervision. Historians still argue whether the cult's popularity rested mostly on concrete services, healing rites, protection for travel, social support, on an emotional register missing in drier civic ritual, or on the Hellenistic talent for making old Egyptian divinities philosophically fashionable. The evidence keeps voting yes. You find a bookish corner and read a scrap of Apuleius, Isis appearing to a shipwrecked man with a voice that sounds like all goddesses translated into one sentence. The promise is not conquest, it is custody. I will guide you. In Roman mouths, Isis becomes cosmopolitan, wearing Greek vowels and Latin favors. In Egyptian hearts, she remains the one who reassembled Osiris and taught grief to sow. The portability is the point. A god at sea who can endure accents will not be unemployed. Daily worship hums with professionalism. Morning ablutions for the statue. Clothing changed like weather for dignity. Incense, hymn, and a small liturgy that knows how to end before hunger becomes impiety. Initiation exists. Private, layered, likely expensive in both coin and commitment. But most devotion is walk-in, processions, vow tablets, donations that buy oil for lamps and bread for the poor. A temple like this runs on a budget that makes sense to anyone who has ever shopped for feast days. Isis shares a city with other traveling gods, Serapis with his philosopher's beard, Magna Mater with her lions and symbols, Mithras with his caves, and for a while, the street conducts a steady traffic of reciprocal nods. A Mithraeus soldier lights a lamp at Isis's Quay festival because his ship leaves at dawn. A matron devoted to Cybele pays a vow at Isis's shrine when her daughter's labor goes long. A Christian, new to the city, watches the procession and files the music under. Beautiful, not mine. The market of comfort is busy and, thus far, polite. Politics comes and goes like weather. Emperors tolerate, suppress, restore, depending on mood, rumor, and public order. Tiberius cracks down after scandals as only a Tiberius can. Claudius reopens shrines with the shrug of a man who trusts harbor gods more than gossip. Domitian dislikes something in the incense. Hadrian, collector of elegant pieties, admires the architecture. Mainstream fact to keep straight. Isis cult sites were periodically banned from within Rome's sacred boundary in the late Republic/early Empire but flourished in the imperial period. By the 2nd century CE, temples of Isis were fixtures in many Roman cities, including a grand complex at Pompeii and later sanctuaries in Ostia and Rome. Pilgrimage to now-scented festivals subcontracts a lot of hope. Spring processions launched the sailing season with practical pomp, the rudder blessed, the sails admired, the sea named politely to remind it of its better behavior. In autumn, Thanksgiving processions swap fear for relief. Survivors hang little plaques. She heard me. A shipyard foreman keeps the goddess's image tacked above his tally board, and you notice how quickly piety becomes policy when the repair schedule depends on weather and worry. You hear, too, the friction at the edges. A synagogue nearby offers prayers for the emperor and for rain, without images or incense. The synagogue's women sell bread to festival crowds because dough has never been an exclusivist. Later, as Christian assemblies grow and eventually win imperial favor, incense before images becomes a test line. A Christian matron who once walked the Navigium for her husband's voyages now refuses the garland but still sends oil for the lamps because she remembers nights on a windy roof counting masts. Habit and orthodoxy begin their negotiations. The goddess's status under late imperial laws shrinks like a shoreline in drought. Temples lose patrons when patronage learns new prayers. Altars go quiet except for cats and schoolboys. Priests trade linen for other employments, or keep it crisp in hope. Some sanctuaries find afterlives as workshops or churches. A fresco of a river god becomes an anonymous pretty thing behind plaster. A sistrum ends up in a chest that late-night curiosity eventually opens. Light joke 2. A deacon tasked with clearing an old shrine finds a box of sistrums and declares them excellent for keeping the choir awake, which is exactly how syncretism survives, in jokes that refuse to be cruel. But the cult's grammar leaves fingerprints you can still see when the building changes names. Mothers who never learned Egyptian still rock infants with a tenderness painted on walls centuries before. Sailors still bless ropes. Women still tie protective knots in garments even when they rename them. Spring still needs a ceremony to trick courage into boarding. Historians still argue whether Isis influenced Christian Mariology directly, mother imagery, protective intercession, star-crowned iconography, or whether both drew from a shared ancient repertoire of comfort. The continuity of hands, women's especially, tells you the debate will be long and probably friendly on good days. You close your eyes at the quay and try a small experiment. Imagine the city without this festival. No boat on shoulders, no water flicked into laughter, no linen that taught sunlight to behave, and the harbor feels a note flatter. With it, the note lifts, embarkation acquires choreography, risk acquires a witness, homecoming acquires a thank you suited to the meal that follows. Mainstream aside to pocket, archaeological remains at Pompeii preserve a richly decorated Iseum. Ostia's riverfront held an Isis precinct near warehouses. Inscriptions record collegia of Isis devotees, individual vows, and priestly titles. Apuleius's Metamorphoses offers a literary window into initiation language, albeit wrapped in novelistic sheen. Light joke 3 before you go. A vendor sells tiny clay boats that sink gracefully in basins. He calls them training vessels, good for teaching children humility. He swears the goddess prefers honest toys. You buy one and promise your Lararium serpents, section 1, that the boat will live on the shelf, symbolic sailing only. They look skeptical but amused. By twilight the linen banner hangs quiet. Ropes finish their arguments. The smell of resin becomes the smell of supper. You pass a doorway where a woman knots her sash with the neat Isis loop and then crosses herself in the new fashion. And you feel history pivot without snapping. The goddess, who was a harbor long before she was a controversy, recedes like the tide that understands it will be back. You walk home with salt on your wrist and a tune in your ear that sounds like bronze impatience, and you realize that not every comfort needs a temple to remain audible. You duck through a narrow doorway that pretends to be unremarkable and find yourself stepping down into a cool corridor where the city's noise forgets your name. The stair treads are worn, the ceiling close enough for your breath to notice, and the smell is the old friendship of oil, leather, and damp stone. You've been above ground with banners and sun, sections 2 to 7. Down here the light is rationed and the voices prefer to be kind. A low arch opens, and there it is, a Mithraic cave, Mithraeum, arranged like a secret remembered correctly. The room is a rectangle pretending to be a cavern. Long benches run down both sides, raised just enough to make kneeling comfortable and sitting communal. A central aisle keeps your feet honest. At the far end a relief glows behind a small altar, Mithras in a Phrygian cap, knee on the back of a cosmic bull, one hand pulling the snout up, the other driving a knife home to a place that looks less like pain and more like punctuation. A dog and a serpent lick at the blood. A scorpion fiddles with the bull's tail as if tuning a lyre. The sun peeks from a corner, the moon from another, both looking like friends who arrived early. Mainstream anchor to set on the stone lip, Mithria across the Roman world, especially in military zones and along trade routes, display this tauroctony scene, with side symbols and zodiac signs. The spaces are small, cave-like halls with flanking benches and an altar, and initiates progress through 7 grades: Raven, Bridegroom, Soldier, Lion, Persian, Sunrunner, Father, each with rites and insignia. You take a place along the bench and feel the layout do most of the work. The low ceiling quiets speech, the close walls flatten rank, the shared table turns strangers into people who pass bread. A man in a white cloak, father of the mysteries here, smiles you into the room with a candled nod. He is not a general, though generals come, not a philosopher, though philosophy has opinions. He is a host trained to keep the lamp steady. The raven grade sits near the door, eager and pretending not to be. The lion wears a small badge and a posture that says he is ready to fetch firewood without being asked. Light joke 1. Someone whispers that the worst trial is learning to sit still while onions roast. You almost laugh. The father's eyebrow convinces you to save it for later. Ritual here tastes like dinner and discipline. A hymn rises, low, syllables stepping carefully. Bread is broken, wine passed. There is talk of contracts and stars, of right action and good comradeship. You have heard noise about blood and bulls. You find heat from lamps and stew. Rites of great advancement are private in detail, vigils, oaths, tests of memory and courage, but public in effect. A man becomes dependable on purpose. The cosmic imagery around you, sun in his chariot, the zodiac marching like a calendar that learned to draw, teaches scale without sermon. You tuck that under the memory of Eleusis. Section 6. One secret taught you to wait for spring. This one trains you to wait for orders without becoming unkind. The tauroctony dominates and puzzles. Is it a cosmological map? A myth of creation where the bull's death seeds life, grain, wine, living things? An astral allegory, the bull as Taurus, the scorpion as Scorpio, the dog and serpent as stars, the whole scene a sky chart carved into devotion? Historians still argue whether the image encodes precise astral lore, precession, constellations, seasonal cycles, recounts an Iranian-rooted myth adapted in Roman terms, or functions mainly as a unifying emblem for discipline and fellowship. You decide the best explanation is how the room behaves. The picture makes everyone look the same way and think about something bigger while they share soup. Bread and cup move with a choreography that would not confuse a household lar. Section 1. The taste is ordinary. That's the point. What separates the cave from the street is the container, not the contents. A promise in close quarters holds weight differently. Quirky tidbit to enjoy by lamplight. Some Mithria, like those at Ostia and along the Danube, contain little basins and pipes under the altar, suggesting water features for ritual, running trickles that would make a cave pretend to be a real cavern. Others embedded tiny star-studded ceilings with lamps sitting in drilled holes, night skies you could light with a wick and a good mood. You catch sight of masks and props stored neatly, a raven beak, a little crown, a cloak lined with yellow, small things ready to turn a lesson into a memory. The 7 grades are not decorations, they are a curriculum. The raven learns to bring, the soldier to endure, the lion to purify with fire and honey, the Persian to imitate wise foreigners, the sunrunner to keep time, the father to father. No grade makes you better than your neighbor. Each makes you more useful to him. Light joke 2. A raven asks when the soup is ready. A lion says, "When it smells like patience." The raven writes that down as if it were a recipe. The membership here skews toward men who sleep near frontier walls. Soldiers, clerks of the legions, ship captains who count weather. But the door is not nailed to one profession. A customs officer knows the grades. A warehouse foreman bears the brand of soot that says he carries wood without complaint. Women are largely absent in the archaeology of Mithraea. Their names appear on donor inscriptions. Their money surely bought oil for lamps. But the gatherings below are male-coded, a laboratory for loyalty when your tent mates may be tomorrow's shield. The father pours wine in measured cups and tells a story in which keeping faith held a bridge longer than courage did. You believe him because the benches believe him. Above ground, festivals queue through bright squares. Section 4. Below, calendars hang from beams. A Mithraeum celebrates birthdays of the sun, marks equinoxes like doors that swing true, and folds Roman festival time into cave time. Soldiers shift posts. The cave eats and prays steadily. The result is an unglamorous miracle. Habits that move better than buildings. When units transfer, someone copies the relief, finds a basement, and the grades begin again, like a play that knows its lines wherever it travels. Mainstream fact to keep in your sleeve: Mithraea. The map from Britain, London's riverside Mithraeum, and the Rhine frontier, Cologne, Trier, across the Danube limes, through Italy, Rome, Ostia, to the Balkans and the East. Most are small, often 20 to 40 diners. Semi-subterranean, with standardized furnishings. The cult flourished 2nd, 4th centuries CE. Imperial patronage was occasional. Some officers and emperors flirted with souls/Mithras imagery. But this was mostly a network of local cells held together by shared iconography and practice. You think of syncretism, Section 5, and see it here in quiet. Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, peeks into the cave often. In some capitals, the sun is on coins while Mithras is in basements. The two share birthdays like cousins who exchange gifts. An initiate explains gently that the sun is a comrade. Mithras is the one who keeps the appointment. You accept the cosmology because the stew is delicious and the men are kind. Friction with neighbors is usually muffled by the ceiling. Jews nearby ignore this room the way they ignore other rooms with images. Early Christians disagree more precisely. A Christian presbyter writes pamphlets above ground accusing cave meals of parody and shadow. A Mithraeus shrugs and says bread is bread and oaths are oaths. For a while, both communities share streets like families that can sit at the same wedding without choosing the same songs. When imperial favor later moves toward church porches, Mithraea go quiet without tantrum. Benches gather dust. The relief keeps its poise. A cave waits very well. Light joke 3. A soldier says the cave's best miracle is that the stew is never burned. A clerk says the best miracle is that the clerk never has to prepare it. The father says the best miracle is that both show up on time. You suspect he is not wrong. What does the bull mean to you, personally, after an hour under this ceiling? Not cruelty, not even victory. It means discipline that gives life somewhere else. Grain sprouting where blood fell is a debate for scholars. Bread shared after a long march is not. The scorpion near the tail becomes a reminder that small annoyances can sting large animals. The dog licking the wound teaches that loyalty does not mind mess. The serpent, patient and cyclical, coils like a word you now understand: endurance. You climb the stairs back into day and blink at how loud sunlight is. The street smells of fish and philosophy again. Your step falls into the city's tempo. You feel the cave lingering as a muscle memory. Sit close, share food, speak plainly, keep vows, let symbols do their patient work. You smile at the thought of your lararium, Section 1, and your Eleusinian loaf, Section 6. You add one more courtesy to your collection. When you can, make rooms where courage can sit down. Historians still argue whether Mithraism's content was deeply Iranian in lineage or largely a Roman construction borrowing an Eastern name to house a Western fellowship. Whether the grades mapped a star course or a moral syllabus. Whether the cult competed with Christianity as a true rival or simply occupied neighboring social niches until patronage shifted. The floorboards of the Mithraeum answer with the sound of men kneeling and standing in unison. By dusk, your shoulders are less noisy. The city gets its light. The cave keeps its cool. The Mithraeum door closes with the modest pride of a room that has done its job. You pass a doorway where someone is tying an Isis knot, Section 7, and a porch where someone is telling a Demeter joke, Section 6. And you realize how many kinds of courage this century learned to coach. Your own you will tend like a lamp, trimmed just enough, lit when needed, and with luck bright enough to help the person next to you read his cup. You wake with a question that coffee can't answer and discover the city has built an entire industry for that mood. Temples schedule certainty, Sections 2 to 4. Mysteries console the wintering heart, Section 6. Caves teach fellowship, Section 8. But some days you need a sentence whispered from a corner that isn't on the calendar. So you walk past the lararium that approves tidy thresholds, Section 1, past the Isis quay that keeps departures polite, Section 7, to places where knowledge arrives sideways. Oracles, astrologers, charm sellers with drawers of tiny courage, and scribes who write curses with the tenderness of a love letter reversed, begin at a shrine where lots are shaken like careful dice. A priestess draws one, reads a verse, and hands you a future phrase like advice. Do the prudent version of the brave thing. You smile. The god has a talent for being right in two directions at once. Far away, Delphi's Pythia sits on her tripod, breathing cave breath and answering in hexameters that make politicians pretend they like poetry. Mainstream anchor to tuck under your sleeve. Throughout antiquity, major oracles, Delphi for Apollo, Dodona with its oak, Ammon at Siwa, issued responses to individuals and states. Roman generals and cities consulted them, even as official Roman auspices and Sibylline books, Section 2, provided homegrown guidance. The trick with oracles is not hearing. It's hearing yourself in time to use what you heard. Closer to home, a Syrian lot oracle in a back room sorts client hopes into tidy bins. A priest asks your name, tosses a pebble in a bowl, and points to a verse tablet that sounds uncannily like your aunt. Historians still argue whether these operations were pure chance sanctified, subtle counseling with props, or scripted theater tuned by gossip. Analyses of surviving lots and verses suggest both randomness and craft. Judging by the priest's knowing smile, you suspect the gods invented social intelligence early. You turn a corner and meet a man with a sky on a tablet. Astrologers, Chaldeans, in the city's shorthand, chart your hour against the quiet habits of Saturn and the temper of Mars. He draws circling lines, raises an eyebrow at a square between Mercury and your plans, and suggests patience on days that already lack it. You protest you don't believe. He counters that the stars don't either, they just keep time, and you can decide whether to dance to it. Light joke 1. He offers a discount if you promise not to blame him for anything good that happens. You promise and pay anyway, which is the real horoscope. Magic lives where medicine runs out and where medicine begins. In a market booth, a woman threads little knots into red wool and sells you a cord for fevers. You laugh, then buy 2 because last winter was rude. A jeweler shows tiny gold leaves engraved with words you shouldn't pronounce unless you mean them. Children wear bully, those neat lockets of childhood, against the evil eye. Your friend keeps his son's old bulla in a drawer and touches it before legal cases as if courage could be recycled. Quirky tidbit to pocket. Some households hang wind chimes, tintinnabula, with comically earnest little phalluses sprouting wings. Nothing ruins an evil glance like a ringing joke at the door. You loiter near a bathhouse drain and watch a different genre of writing slide toward the underworld. Slender sheets of lead, etched with names and verbs that prefer not to be read aloud. Curse tablets, defections, pin adversaries to uncooperative days. Bind the tongue of the slanderer, freeze the feet of the charioteer, confuse the witnesses so truth forgets their address. The scribe folds the tablet, nails it like a tiny coffin, and drops it where spirits are rumored to deliver. Historians still argue whether these petitions were the tools of the desperate poor, the spite of the competitive rich, or a common technology of pressure across classes. Fine spots at baths, arenas, graves, and wells suggest a democracy of anxiety. You feel half appalled, half sympathetic. Who hasn't wished for a strategic stutter in an opponent? Between cursing and blessing lies the charming clatter of amulet sellers. Shelves show eyes to reflect malice back into itself, scarabs for rebirth borrowed from Egyptian cabinets, crescents to cradle infants' sleep, and tiny hands, manus feci, making an obscene gesture so old it has matured into reliability. A midwife recommends a black stone for easing labor pains. A sailor buys an anchor etched with return, and ties it on with a knot that learned virtue from the Isis sash, section 7. Someone sells an onion to wear around the neck against colds. You decline, then discover onions do their best work simply by existing near soup. Magic has its paperwork, too. In a scribe's alcove, the Greek-Egyptian magical papyri, recipes of spirit and syllable, gleam with instructions, the right herb at the right moon, the name that is better sung than spoken, the rite that turns fear into a job with steps. A charm for courtroom success reads like tough love poetry. Wash, bind, speak, do not panic. Historians still argue whether the practitioners behind these books were temple dropouts, freelance ritualists, or physicians with broader toolkits. Their Greek-Egyptian blend shows an educated syncretism that could pivot from Hermes to Abrasax without losing breath. In other words, specialists with lanterns in alleyways where official priests didn't carry theirs. You stop at a shop that prints protective words in handsome capital letters and sets them under glass. A tasteful apotropaic wall for those who like their comfort framed. In a corner, a woman grinds pomegranate rind and mutters the recipe for an anti-migraine charm that sounds suspiciously like an infusion your grandmother already makes. Light joke 2, she says the spell only works if you stop arguing with your pillow. You vow to destroy your enemies by napping strategically. Not all magic is pleading, some is household maintenance. A matron teaches you to draw a line of salt across a threshold to discourage the sort of spirits who mistake your kitchen for a crossroads. A farmer leaves a clay rooster at a boundary stone and says the god of limits prefers early risers. A clerk scratches a fish on his ledger for luck, discovers it looks like bad arithmetic, and settles for a neat bookmark. Your own lararium, Section 1, accepts a new amulet with equanimity. The serpents on the wall have seen worse, probably involving cats. The city keeps its skepticism sharp. The 12 tables dislike certain sorceries. Moving crops from a neighbor's field by spell counted as theft with extra verbs. Later laws fine astrologers who whisper revolution into horoscopes. Emperors expel professional sky readers when politics grows allergic to prediction. A satirist mocks love spells as recipes for disappointment with good smells. Yet the same city consults sibling books when prodigies sweat, Section 2, and ties its ships with extra knots after Isis blesses the rudder, Section 7. The line between religion and magic behaves like a cat. It crosses the room, but only when it feels like it. You commission one thing despite yourself, a little lamella, thin gold folded like a secret, for the inside of a traveling cloak. The inscription is part prayer, part password. Be favorable, spirits. Let me pass like a rumor of good news. The scribe charges too much. You pay without haggling. On the way out, you pass a Christian deacon distributing bread who tells you directly that charity works better than lead at deflecting evil. You promise to test both and report back to your conscience. Astrologers defend their dignity with arithmetic. One shows you how eclipses schedule themselves with the pedantry of a Roman Senate clerk. Another warns that your temper will misread a letter on days when the moon sits contrary to Mercury. You decide to delay writing to your cousin until you can like him again. Mainstream aside to keep, astrology enjoyed immense popularity in the Roman world. Emperors employed court astrologers even while banning public predictions. Technical handbooks circulated widely. Inscriptions and papyri preserve horoscopes for births, questions, and journeys. Skeptics mocked. Clients booked. The stars said nothing and kept being useful. You wonder how deep belief runs in the crowd touching amulets and tasting tonics. The answer feels familiar from Eleusis, Section 6, deep enough to change posture. A bulla steadies a mother's breath. A lot oracle postpones a rash letter. A cursed tablet wastes anger safely downstream. Historians still argue whether efficacy was placebo, social control, micro-ritual therapy, or actual intervention by the names invoked. Your day's data says, when rituals are small and repeatable, the city gets kinder edges. When rage can be folded in lead and thrown in a well, fewer pots break in kitchens. Light joke 3 comes for free. A charm seller tries to upsell you a package, 3 amulets, a love filter, and a horoscope, bundled for success. You tell him you are already spoken for by your laundry list. He prescribes a good broom and charges you for the consultation. You leave richer by a laugh and a line of salt. You will, undoubtedly, over-apply.at dusk. You return home and examine your day's illegal optimism. A thread, a tablet you didn't buy, a horoscope you'll forget unless it's right. You set the thread near the lamp, frown at the dust, and sweep as if Jupiter himself were allergic. The house feels approving. You pour 3 drops of wine at the lararium and think of all the ways Romans supervised uncertainty. Birds across sky, livers on platters, torches in halls, boats on shoulders, stars on wax, words on gold. None are guarantees, all are manners. The city prefers hope with good posture. Mainstream fact to end on an honest note. Archaeological finds of amulets, eyes, crescents, bully, cursed tablets from baths, arenas, and graves, and papyrus handbooks of spells attest to the everyday presence of magic. Laws and literature show both regulation and ridicule. Oracles and astrologers remained fixtures despite periodic crackdowns. The spectrum from official omen to private charm is not a line. It's a street with many doors. You sleep with the lamella tucked in your cloak pocket and a broom leaning near the door like a domesticated spear. If dreams arrive with symbols, you promise to let them be symbols and not schedules. In the morning you will decide whether to visit the synagogue that prays without images, the church that prays with bread, or the friend who swears his new amulet prevents overcooking fish. For now, the only prediction you trust is that blankets are persuasive. They are. You turn off the busy street of altars, sections 2 to 5, and step into a hall where the walls prefer words to statues. Oil lamps make small, practical halos. A marble plaque wears carved letters that know how to stand up straight. At the doorway a menorah is incised with a confidence that doesn't need height. You sit on a bench that faces not a god-shaped figure but a cabinet, the ark, where scrolls sleep like coiled rivers. The servers will be reading, song, and memory. Your lararium at home, Section 1, likes household courage. This room likes promises that survived travel. Mainstream anchor to steady your seat. Jewish communities spread across the Roman world long before and during the Empire. From Judea to Alexandria, from Antioch to Rome, throughout Asia Minor, the Aegean, and beyond. Synagogues functioned as houses of prayer, study, and assembly. Rome generally allowed Jews to keep ancestral customs, Sabbath rest, dietary laws, money for the Jerusalem temple, carving exemptions from civic expectations like the imperial cult. After the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, the Fiscus Judaicus, Jewish tax, redirected the old half-shekel temple due to Jupiter's temple on the capital. Later, the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 135, brought harsher measures in Judea, while diasporic life continued elsewhere with stubborn fluency. You listen as the scroll is lifted, hands careful, cloth respectful, and discover how a book can be a country. The reader chants in a cadence that manages to be both steady and alive. A translator follows in Greek because this is Rome, not Jerusalem, and the neighbors grew up on Homer. The community has learned to live in two grammars, Hebrew for prayer and memory, Greek, or Latin, for markets and minutes. Someone whispers Septuagint, the Greek scriptures that let port cities learn Israel's stories without a tutor, and you realize this room exports ideas like spices. The room's furniture is politics in miniature. No images, because words are safer than statues when you're allergic to idols. A niche for alms, because charity is a weekly habit. A bench for elders. A Moses seat, where the reader sits to teach. Lamps trimmed before sundown on the sixth day so the Sabbath can glide in without anyone making fire. Quirky tidbit. Some households set a double-wicked lamp or arranged pre-torn wicks on Friday afternoon, the ancient equivalent of a timer, so the Sabbath evening could be light without labor. Practical holiness is an art. Outside, the empire keeps its calendar, Section 2. Inside, the Sabbath refuses to negotiate. Commerce pauses. Meals turn ceremonial without becoming fancy. Loaves blessed, wine lifted, psalms that know when to lengthen syllables so the room's breathing synchronizes. You feel the restful stubbornness of a people whose schedule delight weekly whether or not the governor is in a mood. Light joke 1. A Roman neighbor complains that his Jewish friend never helps him move furniture on Saturday. The friend replies that he'll help him not move it on Saturday, which is frankly a more spiritual service. Imperial policy toward this difference behaves like weather with a memory. Privileges: exemption from the emperor's incense, permission to assemble, the right to ship temple funds, until 70, later the right to send synagogue collections, and Sabbath concessions in courts and the army here and there. Irritations: periodic expulsions from Rome under jittery emperors, Tiberius exiles some, Claudius shoos disputants. At the instigation of Chrestus. As one Roman puts it with the accuracy of a rumor, local flare-ups like the Alexandrian riots. The post-war Fiscus Judaicus collected with zeal uneven enough to be a genre. Historians still argue whether Judaism enjoyed a formal category of religio licita, a permitted religion, or whether, more prosaically, ancient custom earned case-by-case tolerance that could be revoked when politics twitched. The paperwork says habit, not charter. What you notice most is the room's permeability. Pagan neighbors step in to listen, the so-called God-fearers, who admire one God and ethical rigor but balk at circumcision and kitchen law. Some give alms, keep a few festival days, avoid idols, and sit near the back like polite regulars at a restaurant where they never order the complicated dish. Mainstream aside, inscriptions and literary sources attest to Sabbamonoi, God-fearers, and full proselytes in city synagogues. Their number and role are debated, but the doorway was busy enough that later Christian missions found it a ready hallway. After 70, the network reorganizes itself with the brisk competence of people who have survived worse. Without a temple, the scroll becomes the center, the table becomes an altar, and study becomes a daily sacrifice offered with ink. Rabbinic teachers begin stitching law and lore into portable walls. How to tithe in a city, how to bless bread in exile, how to keep the Sabbath honest under street lamps with curious neighbors. A legal imagination grows that can turn a courtyard into a Sabbath domain with a shared loaf and a string, an eruv, because community can be engineered by agreement as surely as by stone. Light joke 2. A Roman landlord watches the boundary string being tied and asks if this is magic. The rabbi says yes, the kind where you talk to your neighbors first. Food becomes a diplomacy with plates. Markets sell fish that suddenly need witnesses. Butchers learn that knives can have reputations. Pots are either for milk or meat and start holding grudges if you're sloppy. A kosher stall appears near the Isis Quay, Section 7, and both devotions nod politely over the price of good oil. You develop the useful skill of scanning for the modest sign, the menorah scratched on a lintel, the Hebrew letters over a shop. That means a meal won't require explanations. The synagogue also acts like a guild hall with holidays. Funds support widows, ransom captives, bury the dead with dignity. Romans respect this efficiency because cities respect anyone who can feed, free, and bury without scandal. Dedicatory plaques name archisynagogoe, leaders, gerousia, elders, donors whose gifts installed benches, lamps, and sometimes whole buildings. The effect is civic, a community with a ledger and a conscience. Tension with the street's shared habits remains. Processions go by, Section 4. The synagogue stays put. Imperial birthdays bring incense, Section 3. Jews offer prayers for the emperor's welfare without the smoke, loyalty phrased without the garland. The line holds until local officials take offense or need a scapegoat. Then lawyers quote edicts, elders produce letters from governors, and a city remembers it prefers predictability to purity tests. Into this doorway walks a new argument wearing sandals. The Jesus movement, born Jewish, reading those same scrolls, singing some of the same psalms, eating bread with the same blessing but adding a name that begins to change family dinners. In city after city, the first Christian preachers tried the synagogue first, because that's where people already know Abraham, already prefer one God, already meet weekly, and then move to houses when debates outgrow patience. Historians still argue whether the scale of God-fearers and synagogue-adjacent Gentiles explains Christian growth, a ready audience primed for monotheism, or whether household networks and urban patronage played the larger role. The pattern you witness is practical. A message finds a road already paved by scripture, song, and the habit of sitting together to argue without leaving. After Bar Kokhba, Judea's policy climate chills. Aelia Capitolina replaces Jerusalem in Roman mouths. Certain practices, circumcision, study, leadership, face sharper supervision. The diaspora becomes even more the norm. Yet in Antioch, in Rome's Trastevere, in Ostia above the warehouses, synagogues continue to stamp their menorahs on stone and their melodies on children. A Christian deacon passes the door with loaves for the poor. A Jewish collector passes with a purse for the same street. For a time, both communities staff the city's conscience on adjacent days. Quirky archaeology keeps leaving you friendly notes. A mosaic floor in the Hall of the Seven Sages at Ostia with a bold menorah, shofar, and lulav. Synagogue inscriptions in Aphrodisias and Sardis listing donors with Greek names and Jewish titles. Lamp bottoms scratched with tiny menorahs because even light likes good company. These artifacts speak in the city's two voices at once. Where does this leave your map of Roman religion? With a crucial room that declined to join the stew, Section 5, and thereby taught the city a new kind of pluralism, protected difference that could be read, taxed, occasionally bullied, often left alone, and, most unexpectedly, used as scaffolding by the next faith that would reshape the map. The synagogue gave the empire a template for urban worship without images, scripture read as law and story, weekly time consecrated by rest, charity woven into calendar. When Christianity learned to be a public thing, it borrowed many of those muscles, even as it argued theology fiercely with the people who first exercised them. Light joke 3. A Roman official asks a synagogue elder why the community refuses to honor all the gods. The elder smiles and says, "We tried one god and found him sufficient. Your budget must be exhausting." The official laughs, because budgets are universal. Mainstream fact to fold with care, diaspora synagogues operated legally across the empire. Jews enjoyed notable privileges alongside notable burdens, including the Fiscus Judaicus after 70. Tensions flared intermittently, Alexandria, Rome under certain emperors. Post-70 Judaism recentered on synagogue, study, and law. Christian missions repeatedly engaged synagogues before forming separate assemblies. Historians still argue whether Rome's toleration was principle or habit, and whether Jewish, Christian separation was swift or centuries-long gradient. City stones and long arguments suggest gradients everywhere. Why dust the scroll is wrapped, the lamps pinched, the bench warm from an hour of listening to sentences that remember deserts and kings. You step back into the street where idols watch with blank patience and think, here is a people who taught a city to schedule conscience. Tomorrow you'll follow the Jesus assemblies as they learn to be public without altars, and the tone of the empire's prayers will change. For tonight you respect a room that kept its promises portable, and taught others to do the same. You find the doorway by accident, which is how these things usually begin. A weaver you know nods you down a corridor that smells of olive oil and dust, then across a courtyard where pigeons review policy. Inside, benches face a table not unlike your own at home, and a cup sits there with the easy authority of something that knows it will be lifted. You've been sitting in synagogues where scrolls carry a people, section 10. Tonight you sit in a room where a letter will cross an empire faster than a horse, carried in memory, repeated aloud, and folded into bread. The letter arrives in a hand that doesn't own it. Phoebe, perhaps, or another courier with sandals that understand distances. She stands near the table, unrolls a sheet, and the room leans forward. You hear greetings to people you met at market yesterday, and you realize this is how geography becomes friendship. Mainstream anchor to set beside the cup, earliest Christian communities met in houses across the Roman world, Rome, Corinth, Philippi, Ephesus, linked by itinerant teachers and letters of Paul and others. Those letters were read aloud in gatherings and circulated between churches, e.g., Colossians mentions sharing with Laodicea, becoming the bones of a canon long before anyone used that word instead of, "Please pass this along." The meal moves like a memory that has decided to be a habit. Bread is blessed with words you recognize from synagogue but bent around a name you heard first in the marketplace, Jesus. The cup follows, modest and convinced. The story told is not new to Rome. Gods who die and return are a genre, but the tone is scandalously domestic. A crucified Jew raised, forgiveness served as if it were soup, belonging granted to people who have never agreed on anything before supper. Light joke 1. A baker whispers that the miracle is not raising the dead but getting his neighbors to share olives evenly. The deacon smiles and adds a second bowl. You count unusual neighbors. A free woman with a laugh that can find a good chair. A retired centurion who folds his hands as if swords were a rumor. A couple who argue gently about whether the psalm should go up or down at the third line. A child whose bulla has been replaced by a small cross scratched onto a walnut shell, fierce in the way only walnut shells can be. Women speak plainly. Some host the assembly. One reads. Another corrects with a kindness that feels like authority that stopped pretending to be shy. Quirky tidbit for your sleeve. The earliest tituli, house church sites, you'll later trace in Rome's catacomb inscriptions preserve women's names as diakonos, presbytera, hotly debated titles, and donors. Archaeology in places like Dur Europos shows a house adapted into a baptistry with painted walls, river scenes, shepherds, a room that learned to be a font. Persecution is not yet the constant whether the street later remembers. Tonight the threat is more social than lethal. A neighbor who complains about singing, a guild that frowns if you skip incense at its festival, section 5. A family that worries you've joined a club with poor boundaries and too much joy. Historians still argue whether early opposition was primarily local, trade guild friction, household disputes, official, edict and enforcement, or episodic, scapegoats in crises, fires, famines. The record shows patches, Nero's Rome after the fire, provincial governors like Pliny asking Trajan how to test loyalties, occasional martyrdoms that compose a grim calendar of courage. The letters do specific work you can taste. A note to Corinth regulates a chaotic potluck. No one goes home hungry while others nap under full plates. A note to Galatia insists that Gentile men do not need surgery to sit at the table. A note to Rome dreams a unity that stretches from synagogue pews to street corners. The authors argue like people who care about tomorrow's seating chart. Light joke 2. A reader trips on a long sentence of Paul's and says he will insert commas next time. A teacher says commas are a later heresy. The room forgives both and asks for more wine. Baptism turns a back room into a river. A basin stands ready. A pitcher has learned to be generous. Someone steps down into water and comes up blinking and wet, and the room claps the way markets clap when a squall finally passes. The imagery is shamelessly borrowed and shamelessly new. Death and rising, washing and naming, adoption into a family that claims both Abraham and fishermen with cracked hands. A psalm follows in a key that makes the ceiling sympathetic. You think of Eleusis, section 6, and understand. Here too a drama claims to make death intelligible. But instead of torches and secrecy, the props are daylight and the neighbors. You spend a day shadowing a deacon and discover the city's arteries. Alms collected in a wicker basket become bread on a widow's table by noon. That widow, incidentally, can recite Isaiah faster than you can peel garlic. Collections travel outward with the letters. Famine in Judea becomes dinner in Corinth. Prisoners become names and prayers that refuse to end. Mainstream aside to tuck into your ledger. Christian almsgiving and care for the poor, sick, and imprisoned are attested early and often. Even critics notice the habit. By the 3rd century, organized diaconal networks in cities were significant enough that persecution sometimes targeted church treasuries because compassion had a budget. The assembly borrows synagogue manners, scripture read and sung, tweaks them, a memoir of Jesus added, a table where Gentiles aren't guests but kin, and invents new infrastructure, lists of widows, traveling letters with commendations, fast days that disagree with the city but make sense to stomachs trained to be persuasive. The ethic is startlingly domestic. Husbands, wives, children, slaves, masters, household codes call everyone to a courtesy that looks impossible until supper proves it has been happening for weeks. Light joke 3. A child sprints through the prayers chasing a lizard. An elder says this congregation is lively in spirit. The mother says the lizard is more devout than the child. The child names the lizard Spirit to win the argument. Rumor paints Christians as gloomy or secretive, atheists for skipping idols, cannibals for odd talk about eating a body, conspirators because they like each other. You taste the room and find none of it fits. If atheism smells like bread, the city may adapt. If conspiracy is this public with its groceries, perhaps plots are just shared shopping lists. The awkwardness is real around guild altars and imperial birthdays, sections 3 to 4. Incense before the emperor's image becomes the line in the mosaic. Some will cross it politely, others will refuse and lose work. A few will refuse and lose their pulse. Martyr accounts begin to circulate, some plain as receipts, others embroidered by admiration, all telling the same chorus. Do not lie with your body about whom you love. Historians still argue whether the rapid spread of these house assemblies rests chiefly on care networks, alms, burial clubs, meals, on theology that fit the anxieties of mixed-class cities, on women's leadership and hospitality, or on the portable charisma of letters and preachers. Your week with the deacon answers with a shrug and a loaf. The mix did the work. A funeral done well persuaded as surely as a sermon. A mended cloak preached as steadily as a bishop. Your lararium, section 1. Looks at you curiously when you bring this home. You are not embarrassed. You explain to the serpents on the wall that you have eaten in a room where the household expanded without breaking. The Penates, if they could, would appreciate the logistics. You still sweep the threshold. You still nod at the Laras in a kindly way. But your hand reaches for the cup at memory's command, and you find that names you learned tonight rest easily beside the old stories. For now the city contains the tension by being busy. Mainstream fact to place with care next to the lamp. By the early 2nd century, Christian communities are attested by Pliny in Bithynia. By mid-2nd, Justin's Apologies describe worship, readings, sermon, prayers, Eucharist, collections. By the 3rd, house churches, cemeteries, catacombs in Rome, and bishops appear in city after city. Persecution remains sporadic until the Great Persecution, early 4th, after which Constantine's favor moves assemblies from borrowed rooms to basilicas, a story you'll feel in section 13. The letters read tonight will eventually become scripture. The cup passed tonight will eventually live on marble under domes. Before you leave, an elder asks you to carry a greeting to another house 2 streets away. You nod, memorize names, and step into the evening where lamps make windows into arguments about dinner. You feel less like a convert than like a courier, words in your pocket, bread in your breath, and an awkward smile that thinks kindness is a strategy as well as a virtue. You pass a Mithraeum stair, section 8, and an Isis lintel, section 7, and the synagogue's quiet door, section 10, and you realize this city has become a conversation conducted by rooms. You deliver the greetings. The new room answers as if you had brought a letter from spring. On the walk home, you let yourself imagine basilicas not yet built and councils not yet convened, but you return your thoughts to the simple arithmetic of tonight: 1 cup, 1 loaf, many names, a door that was not locked. Tomorrow, the guild will frown, the calendar will try to disagree, and a governor somewhere will misread everything. But this evening, something fragile discovered that it is also stubborn. You blow out your lamp and leave a crumb on the sill for the Penates out of habit. Then you add a quiet thanks in a newer grammar and sleep on both sides of the threshold at once. Old courtesies, new courage. Hoping the city will keep making rooms where strangers can become kin at the speed of bread. You spend a season watching reputations change hands the way lamps change oil, quietly, with a little scorch on the fingers. You've eaten housebread that called strangers kin, section 11. You've stood under altars that taught crowds to be polite, section 4. Now the city tests which habits can endure frowns. Persecution is a word that travels. In practice it arrives as paperwork, whispers, and sometimes iron used in a way iron dislikes. You start with the lowest temperature, social chill. A guild feast includes a pinch of incense for the emperor's image, sections 3 to 4. Your Christian neighbor bows out, and suddenly contracts break like pottery. A cousin says the new worship is unsociable, no garlands, no sacrifices. Then adds that the singing is lovely, which makes the complaint sound less muscular. A synagogue elder, long used to threading loyalty without idols, section 10, shrugs and offers advice about surviving holidays without losing friends. Bring extra bread. Bring better jokes. Light joke 1. When pressed to explain why he won't sprinkle incense, a Christian fishmonger says he already smells like devotion. The official holding the dish laughs despite himself and waves him along. Paper chases people next. A magistrate receives a letter about secret meetings. He prefers public noise to secret silence, so he tests the waters with a warning. Some Christians recite loyalty to the emperor, refuse the incense, and pay a fine. Others, hungry and stubborn, refuse both fee and flame. You stand outside a hearing where a governor quotes policy that sounds reasonable until it meets a conscience. The exchange feels like two good neighbors explaining their kitchens to each other at the wrong hour. Then the fire breaks out that changes everything. Nero's Rome, the one every storyteller keeps in a jar. Blame seeks a home and finds the people called Christians. Lamps at night, punishment staged as theater. Teach the city a new word, spectacle that failed to be popular. Mainstream fact to lay gently on the bench. Roman persecution before the 4th century is episodic and local. Nero's reprisals after the fire, Trajans. Don't seek them out but punish if obstinate. Letter via Pliny, Decius's empire-wide certificates of sacrifice in the 250s, Valerian's brief, sharper edicts, then the great persecution under Diocletian starting 303 with edicts to destroy churches, scriptures, and require sacrifice. Between these storms, long calms where Christians shop, marry, bury, and sing as if bureaucracy were merely weather. You copy the rhythm of edict and exception. Under Decius, the city invents a new document, the libellus, a certificate proving you sacrificed. Some Christians do, some don't, some borrow of friends, some bribe a clerk, some present a chicken that may or may not count. Afterward, communities must welcome the wavering back or learn the art of permanent scowls. Historians still argue whether the lapsi, those who lapsed under pressure, should have been readmitted quickly for unity or slowly for honesty, whether rigor made faith strong or brittle, whether bishops who brokered mercy saved neighborhoods or diluted courage. Your ears report a human outcome, parishes that forgave well-kept better bakers. You meet patronage as the other weather, warm rain that turns a path into a road. A wealthy widow funds a burial ground where no one is turned away for being unprofitable. A shipowner pays for oil in a famine because letters from Jerusalem asked and the port answered. A senator's wife, converted quietly by household staff, turns her dinners into audition nights for generosity. Quirky tidbit to place beside the bread basket. In the catacombs, slabs record donors who gifted cubicula, small burial rooms, for brothers and strangers alike, and sometimes include doodled loaves or fish as if the stone wanted to remember taste as well as names. The poor, orphans, widows, the sick, become the city's syllabus. You shadow a deacon who knows which alleys cough. He hands out broth, carries letters, and collects names for next week's list. A pagan neighbor watches and admits that the Christians have built a better rumor mill for kindness. News of need now travels with the efficiency of gossip but without the sting. When plague arrives, some flee, no shame, some stay, no trumpet, and the staying writes itself into memory. Historians still argue whether Christian survival advantages in epidemics, nursing, hydration, light care, explain growth more than doctrine does. Your broom says warm water and soup are evangelists with aprons. Conversions happen like weather shifts, by fronts and by drafts. A philosopher reads a gospel and decides it's good platonism with better bread. A soldier watches a baptism and decides he trusts people who go into water calm. A market woman sees her friend's temper shrink and decides that's the God she wants. There are also strategic conversions. A patron finds that becoming the patron of a parish is the surest way to turn reputation into policy. A freedman discovers that the church's network is the best delivery route for his better oil. Motives stack like loaves on a cooling rack, some whole grain, some sweet. Not all stories wear wreaths. A deaconess is arrested. Her household stalls, argues, bribes, fails. She learns the geography of a prison the way others learn a warehouse. A bishop negotiates for confiscated cups by surrendering his library instead. traditor in one mouth, practical in another, earning a controversy that will outlive his good debtors by centuries. You attend a burial where someone reads a martyr's letter with a voice that folds tears into diction. The city, stricken and curious, stands further back than usual and listens as if language could smell like courage. Patronage grows visible. A domina opens her atrium weekly for scripture and soup. Lamps multiply. Singers learn to breathe softer at the edges so neighbors will be more amused than annoyed. An artisan donates his work, a carving for a baptistry, a painted shepherd for a wall, a cupboard that locks because receipts need a home. Some patrons give money, others give rooms, others give introductions. You should meet the prefect's clerk, he likes psalms. And social ladders become handrails instead of trophies. Meanwhile, pamphlets fly like small, earnest birds. Anti-Christian writers accuse, bishops rebut, philosophers interpret. Local poets make jokes that land better in taverns than in bookshops. A familiar cycle emerges. Rumors of secret feasts answered by open tables. Charges of atheism answered by prayers for the emperor with no statues, accusations of novelty answered by long, loving tours through Israel's older sentences. The best apologetic, you notice, is a neighbor who lends tools without writing a poem about it. Then the temperature changes. Not a single decree yet, that is Section 13's weather, but a drift in the air. An official hints that enforcement is tiresome. A centurion winks at a deacon during grain distribution. A city's leading men begin to include one or two who cross themselves when the lightning is far off. Your friend the augur, Section 2, remarks, without rancor, that birds are being consulted less frequently. Your friend at the imperial altar, Section 3, jokes, without panic, that wreath vendors are learning to sell lamps. You smile, because even your lararium serpents, Section 1, can feel a hinge turning. Mainstream fact to hold steady. Before Constantine, conversion of elites accelerates unevenly. Some houses adopt Christianity as part of their new seriousness, others because a matron or daughter became the household's conscience. By the early 4th century, enough Christians populate cities and garrisons that empire-wide edicts finally bother to notice in a comprehensive way. In other words, patronage has been doing policy's slow work long before policy learns its own future tense. Historians still argue whether persecution grew the church by pruning or scattered it by fear, whether martyrs made converts by theater or by testimony, whether patronage domesticates a radical message or funds it to reach more kitchens. Your notebook votes for the mixed economy of courage. Some grew by reading, some by nursing, some by losing their temper less, some by losing their life at a pace that taught others to live differently. You end your tour in a courtyard where a small crowd learns the choreography of alms without condescension. A senatorial son, newly serious, carries a basket heavier than his previous principles. An old woman corrects his posture and his theology in the same sentence. He thanks her as if she had saved him from a hole. Light joke too. A child tasked with counting loaves declares, 5,000. And everyone forgives the exaggeration because the mood is generous and the bread is excellent. By dusk, you can smell tomorrow. A letter from a Western court mentions toleration and property restoration. A rumor from the Danube mentions an emperor marching under a sign he did not use to respect. Lamps in house churches burn later than usual with an energy that is half prayer, half administration. Lists to update, roofs to find, a widow who still coughs. You pass an altar where an aedile is carefully folding a garland for storage, and he nods to you like a man who respects competent neighbors. You go home and set 2 lamps. One for the house gods who have minded your thresholds, section 1. One for the table that has taught you to bless enemies by feeding them, section 11. You tell the serpents that tomorrow may legalize rooms that already behave themselves. They, being painted and wise, decline to speculate. You pinch both wicks and decide that if empire is about to change its prayers, kitchens will still need sweeping and widows will still need broth. And that, you suspect, is how patronage becomes policy without losing its manners. Light joke 3 before sleep. You promise to write fewer notes in the margins of other people's letters. Your conscience replies that marginalia are your spiritual gift. You negotiate a smaller handwriting. Tomorrow will bring edicts, basilicas, councils, and creeds, sections 13 to 14. Tonight you catalog the things that do not require permission: bread, letters, hands that show up, and a patience that outlasts frowns. You fall asleep to a city humming the quiet song of conversion. Less thunderclap, more habit, backed by the low drum of patronage learning to keep time. Morning arrives carrying a rumor on its back and a banner in its pocket. You've spent a season watching kindness learn logistics, section 12. Now law decides to put on its good sandals and catch up. You are not in a palace when the hinge turns. You are in an ordinary courtyard where a deacon is sorting lentils, and someone says, very calmly, "It's legal now." The sentence lands like rain on a roof that has been waiting to prove it works. You test the air the Roman way, with paper. Edicts circulate, the kind that smell like fresh wax and compromise. The words are careful, but the effect is simple: gather again, repair what was broken, return what was taken if you can find it without starting a new war over old candlesticks. Mainstream anchor to set neatly on the table. In 313, Constantine and Licinius issued the so-called Edict of Milan, granting to Christians, and all others, the liberty to practice religion and providing for the restitution of confiscated church properties. This did not make Christianity the empire's official creed, but it legalized and favored it, shifting patronage toward basilicas and bishops while leaving other cults on the books. For the moment, you decide to walk your usual route and watch. Rooms change shape. The house church where you ate last week, section 11, has a visitor from the prefect's office who says the lease will be honored and, by the way, do you require lumber? Across the square, a Mithraeum door, section 8, stays quiet. No edict forbids it, but you feel the temperature difference. One room is being measured for windows. The other is adjusting its wicks. At the quay, an Isis priest, section 7, practices courtesy with extra polish. A synagogue elder, section 10, nods with the old calm that comes from having survived many calendars. Buildings begin to learn a new grammar. Basilicas, long halls with columns like sentences that refuse to hurry, sprout where markets can hear them. You step into one mid-construction. Sawdust smells like progress, and a foreman measures the apse with a string that has opinions. The plan is secular in origin. Basilicas were court and business halls, but the furniture will be theological. An altar, a bishop's chair that looks like a punctuation mark, an ambo where readers will tame long sentences with breath. Light joke 1. A carpenter asks whether the bishop prefers early Christian minimalist or late Roman practical. The bishop says he prefers a roof that does not leak and a door that discourages goats. Patronage expands its stride. Senators who used to fund baths now fund fonts. Matrons who once endowed porticos now endow porches where the poor queue without embarrassment. Imperial money, when it arrives, arrives with marble and a small army of painters who know exactly how to make a shepherd look kind at scale. You watch a scribe inventory confiscated goods being returned and learn the comedy of bureaucracy. 1 chalice, dented, 3 lamps, 2 functional, 1 cupboard, stubborn, a basket that insists it is evidence. Quirky tidbit to enjoy with your dust. Some restitution lists and papyri really do read like domestic epics. Lamps, cloths, cups. Humble goods that prove churches were households with ledgers long before they were landmarks. Law doesn't just build, it arbitrates. Bishops suddenly find their letter-writing habit, Section 11, turning into appellate jurisdiction. Parties agree to let a bishop judge because he is nearby, known, and cheaper than an angry praetor. The emperor writes letters to bishops with the tone of a man who has discovered competent volunteers. Historians still argue whether Constantine's favor primarily sacralized imperial power, purple learning to speak in psalms, or bureaucratized Christianity, charity learning to stamp receipts. You suspect both happened. The court acquired a conscience with a choir, and the church acquired a filing system with an eagle. Doctrinal storms, formerly indoor weather, blow onto public squares. A presbyter named Arius sings catchy songs about a son who is wonderful but not fully equal, and half the city hums along before coffee. Another bishop, Athanasius, will soon develop the stamina of a mule and the aim of a well-thrown loaf. Councils assemble because house arguments have grown too tall for kitchens. You trail a delegation to Nicaea and discover that ecumenical travel smells like packed figs, borrowed cloaks, and notes in the margins of creeds. Mainstream aside to fold neatly, in 325, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, which produced a creed confessing the Son, of one substance, homoousios, with the Father and issued canons on church order. Imperial presence did not compose the creed, but it funded the logistics and enforced the decisions variably, inaugurating a rhythm of councils where politics and theology learned to share a table. You notice Christianity changing posture without changing its shoes. Almsgiving keeps its routes. Widows still receive broth. Catechumens still study in rooms that smell like lamp oil and patience. But the scale shifts. Where 20 were fed, now 200. Where one lector learned to project, now a choir learns modes. A deacon who once trudged alleys now carries a letter with an imperial seal asking a city to return a cemetery gate. He walks exactly as fast as before because hurry never improved a hinge. Old cults do not vanish overnight. They negotiate. A festival for the emperor's genius, Section 3, loses some volume but keeps the parade. A temple's treasury remains practical even as its porch becomes a favorite shortcut for people headed to basilica doors. Historians still argue whether suppression of pagan practice was late and sudden or early and incremental. The paper trail suggests a long twilight. Local bans on sacrifice here, temple closures there, subsidies withdrawn, privileges reallocated, laws tightening across the later 4th century with sharper teeth under Theodosius. On your street, twilight looks like fewer garlands at altars and more lamps in halls. The city keeps its manners while it rearranges its budgets. You sit at a sermon where a bishop explains the new relationship between altar and empire with metaphors that work better than policies. He says the emperor is a sheep, albeit a shiny one. He says the church is not a department but a neighbor with keys. He says charity is still the rule because poverty did not resign. Light joke too. He warns against using basilicas as covered markets. A fishmonger coughs guiltily and shifts his basket. Everyone smiles because the sermon includes him by name without saying his name. Imperial favor attracts lawsuits, of course. A man claims his garden is actually ancient church property because his grandmother once lent it for a vigil. Another claims his grandmother was a basilica. Bishops arbitrate, roll their eyes, and invent parish boundaries so that neighbors can share a wall without sharing breakfast. Meanwhile, clergy exemptions from some civic duties create tension with curiales. Section 13 of your coinage tour. Councils issue canons to prevent opportunistic ordinations performed solely to dodge taxes. Law welcomes a new habit and immediately remembers to suspect it. The aesthetics of worship climb a rung. Vestments get nicer, still linen at heart. Vessels glint, still for wine. Incense. Once the empire's olfactory politics, Section 3, becomes prayer's breath. A skeptic complains that smoke is smoke. A deacon replies that meaning is a recipe. Same ingredient, different feast. You watch an old woman touch the new marble with the same reverence she once reserved for a wooden table, and you decide beauty is how cities tell their children what matters. Not everything is applause. A philosopher grumbles that bishops quote emperors too easily. A monk in the desert writes letters warning cities not to baptize vanity. A former confessor of the faith frowns at crowds who now love what they once feared. You, being practical, note that soup still tastes the same and that the choir has improved its pitch. Light joke 3. A choirmaster bans a popular tavern tune from the psalm. The congregation hums it anyway at half speed. The bishop calls it pious recall and moves on. Quirky legal corner. Confiscated cemeteries. Under persecution, some catacomb entrances were seized or sealed. Now, restorations come with processions that look like the city remembering its dead properly. You carry a lamp into a gallery where names smile from stone. A deacon recites a list that sounds like a litany and an audit combined. Returned, repaired, reconsecrated. Upstairs, the street noise resumes as if to say life and memory have signed a treaty. Where do your other friends land in this new weather? The augur, Section 2, retires with dignity and a wry collection of bird stories. The imperial cult priest, Section 3, turns out to be an excellent basilica treasurer because numbers do not change their religion. The Isis devotee, Section 7, keeps her knot as a family charm while teaching her daughter to sing a psalm. A Mithraeum comrade, Section 8, shows up at dawn services because habits of early rising transfer well. The synagogue continues its week with the serenity of people who have seen empires adopt many postures. The street becomes an anthology rather than a monologue. Mainstream fact to tuck beside your lamp. Constantine supported churches with funds and favors, clerical privileges, episcopal courts in some matters, construction grants, intervened in disputes, and legislated in ways that increasingly aligned civic time with Christian observances, Sunday as a day of rest for many occupations by 321. Yet he also retained pontifical titles and allowed traditional rights at courtly levels. The 4th century is not a switch but a dimmer slowly turning until, under later emperors, some lights are decisively off and others newly bright. Historians still argue whether Christianization was mostly urban stagecraft led by elites or a grassroots conversion of habits that later recruited elites. Whether legal changes forced hearts or merely followed them. Whether paganism died by decree or retired by attrition. Your sandals report that soup lines grew first, then porches, then laws. That hearts changed like weather, locally, and that decrees were umbrellas, not clouds. You end the day in a basilica still smelling of lime and paint. A child runs his hand along a column and announces it is taller than the old house. His grandmother says the old house fed him. Both are right. You step outside into a city that now closes some shops on the day after Saturn's market because a carpenter emperor said rest is civilized. You buy bread anyway because bakers keep Rome from arguing with breakfast. Night folds in. You light the lararium lamp out of affection for old courtesies, Section 1, and then cross yourself with the domestic confidence you learned around a table, Section 11. The serpents on the wall look tolerant. They have seen many legal turns and know that kitchens endure beyond decrees. Tomorrow will bring councils, creeds, and the patient retirement of altars. Tonight brings a simpler triumph, neighbors singing where they used to whisper, a roof that sheds rain, and a scribe who has finally learned to spell homousios without stopping for a snack. You take your place under a basilica roof that still smells faintly of lime, Section 13, and discover that this is what happens when house arguments outgrow kitchens. The empire reserves the biggest meeting room it owns, invites everyone who has memorized a psalm and an opinion, and asks them to define mystery with sentences that won't tip over. You've seen augurs mark a square of sky, Section 2. Now bishops mark a square of speech, words fenced carefully so prayer won't wander into ditches. The day begins like a market of metaphors. One group hums a melody that says the Son is splendid but somehow downstream from the Father. Another group sings back that if salvation is to be more than flattery, the Son must be as God as God. Scribes sharpen reeds. Acclamations rise like waves. Imperial ushers practice the hard art of shushing. On a table near the apse sits a creed in progress, its clauses aligned like stones across a river. Mainstream anchor to tuck beside your lamp, the Council of Nicaea, 325, confessed the Son, of one substance, homousios, with the Father against Arius. The Council of Constantinople, 381, reaffirmed and expanded the creed, speaking more clearly of the Holy Spirit. Ephesus, 431, affirmed Mary as Theotokos, God-bearer. Against Nestorius, Chalcedon, 451, confessed one and the same Christ in two natures, without confusion or division. These dates will later live on church walls the way harvests live on granary doors. You learn the rhythm of a conciliar day. First, documents are read aloud until the air grows papery. Then, a bishop with a voice like good bread stands and proposes a clause. The room tries it on for size. If it pinches, someone suggests a different verb. If it sags, someone tightens an adjective. The word homousios lands with the thud of something that will carry weight without creaking. A deacon grins because he will be the one explaining it to catechumens in 6 cities before winter. Light joke 1. A weary scribe mutters that homousios has too many vowels for a travel-sized creed. Another replies that the extra vowels are where the heresies leak out. You watch the empire learn to host a family debate. At Nicaea, Constantine presides not as a theologian but as a man who likes roofs that don't leak and sentences that don't fight. He wants a creed everyone can sign without lying. The bishops want a creed that will still be true when the ushers go home. Historians still argue whether imperial presence shaped decisions decisively or simply funded logistics and punished the worst shouting. Sources push and pull, but the minutes read like a marriage of convenience that occasionally discovered affection. Your ears decide that emperors supplied mail service and deadlines. Bishops supplied grammar and a willingness to nap on floors. In the corridors, you learn how words rescue prayer from shortcuts. If Christ is less than the Father, then your baptism feels like a polite formality. If he is not truly human, your tears sit unbaptized at the edge of the font. The creed stitches divinity and humanity into one sentence that can be sung by people who own sandals. Constantinople adds the Spirit in a voice that sounds like wind behaving itself. The congregation outside notices the difference immediately. Hymns grow steadier. Funerals speak more frankly. Children ask bolder questions without breaking the furniture. Ephesus, though, teaches you that truth sometimes arrives with elbows. Nestorius, anxious to protect Christ's two realities, dislikes calling Mary Theotokos. Others, Cyril most thunderously, say Theotokos protects the unity of the one person born, suffered, and raised. Crowds in the city take sides with the cheerful irresponsibility of fans at the circus. Section 4. Quirky tidbit for your sleeve. Ephesus produced street chants. Theotokos. That sounds suspiciously like team anthems. When the council favored Cyril's side, lamps were lit, and the city escorted bishops home as if they'd won something more than syllables. You remember your Lararium serpents, Section 1, and think, even kitchens prefer their recipes not to separate. Chalcedon gives you the bravest sentence you will ever try to keep in your mouth without dropping. One and the same Christ, acknowledged in two natures, without confusion, change, division, or separation. It is a fence made of 4 posts. No mixing, no mutating, no splitting, no severing, and the bishop who reads it looks like a mason satisfied with his corners. Immediately you hear the ground tremble farther east. Not everyone will walk easily inside this fence. Historians still argue whether Chalcedon's language was a generous bridge between Alexandrian and Antiochian habits, or a Latin-Greek truce that failed to translate into Syriac and Coptic. The result in history's ledger is a family of non-Chalcedonian churches, often called Miaphysite, who kept a different grammar without surrendering faithfulness. The empire learns that unity on paper can outrun unity on streets. Between sessions, you attend the minor miracles that keep councils human. A lector memorizes a page overnight because the only copy is smudged. A deacon persuades a baker to extend credit to theology. A widow's fund feeds visiting clergy who arrived with zeal and without provisions. You spot your old friend, the former imperial cult treasurer, Section 13, counting collection baskets with the serenity of a man who has seen larger budgets go missing. Light joke 2. A monk scolds the market for selling pastries shaped like scrolls. The market replies that doctrine digests better with honey. The monk buys 2 to prevent heresy. On the floor. The heresiarchs acquire caricatures that make you suspicious of tidy villains. Arius' songs were catchy. Nestorius worried for reasons that look pastoral when you squint. Eutychs meant to protect the unity of Christ, not abolish his humanity like a careless cook. You filed this under. People rarely wake planning mischief. A note you also keep in the drawer with your curse tablet restraint, Section 9. The creeds, then, are not victory speeches but guardrails, preventing piety from drifting into metaphors that would empty chalices and undo funerals. Mainstream aside to keep your feet honest, creeds and canons traveled by letter and were re-received repeatedly. Nicaea's creed read at Constantinople. Chalcedon appealing back to Nicaea. Local synods echoing, editing, enforcing. What we call orthodoxy was not a single shout but a chorus, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in disciplined counterpoint, with emperors alternately conducting, leaving, or changing the program mid-performance. The copyists do their slow, proud labor. A deacon corrects homoios to homousios with the infinitesimal dash that separates similarity from shared essence. You have never respected a single iota more. Margins fill with notes. Read slowly here, breathe. This clause saves widows from bad sermons. The creed you will hear on most Sundays after this. Perhaps standing under a dome perfumed with incense that used to belong to politics, Section 3, will be the Niceno-Constantinopolitan blend. It will be long enough to steady you and short enough to memorize before the bread cools. Not every effect is immediate or charitable. Imperial officials sometimes wield creeds like arrest warrants. Bishops sometimes prefer anathemas to conversation. Monks occasionally compose theological insults of such vigor that even your Mithraeum friends, Section 8, would suggest an early night. Yet the best fruit is practical. Widows are fed by churches that pray the same words. Travelers can stop at an unfamiliar basilica and recognize the meal by its grammar. Preachers inherit a lattice strong enough to hold their local stories. You find yourself collecting how creeds change errands. A mother explains to a child that the world was made from the Father, not from leftovers. A dying man repeats, was made human, as if the clause were a warm cloth. A baker hums, light from light, and burns fewer loaves because the meter recommends patience. Light joke 3, a choir practices, proceeds from the Father, and the bass is add, and gets on with it. The choirmaster sighs, and the Spirit presumably forgives amateurs. By dusk, you step outside with a sensation you recognize from Eleusis. Section 6. You have seen something old become newly walkable. The creed did not invent the road. It put stones in the soft places so carts carrying bread and courage won't sink after rain. Historians still argue whether doctrine primarily protects mystery or imprisons it, whether creeds are fences or recipes. Your sandals vote for recipes, measured ingredients that let cooks in different towns make the same nourishing soup without tasting like each other's shadows. You pass a shuttered temple that once taught the city to be polite, Section 4, and a synagogue where words still hold the people, Section 10, and you think about how many grammars the empire learned to speak. The Lararium at home, Section 1, will not object if you add this creed to the drawer where you keep household vows. The serpents on the wall enjoy good sentences. So do you. When you lie down, you recite the clauses softly, surprised by how well they land in a room that has carried so many other prayers. The city beyond your window hums its mixed anthem, some incense for memory, some lamps for tomorrow, and you drift towards sleep guarded by verbs that refuse to panic. Tomorrow, the map will shift again, shrines closing, monasteries opening, Section 15, but tonight you are content to have watched speech behave like scaffolding, plain, sturdy, and kind to roofs. You wake to a city that has learned a new habit of quiet. The great porticos, Section 4, still throw shade, coins still argue with prices, and your Lararium serpents, Section 1, still supervise the broom. But door by door, a different kind of room has multiplied, houses where men or women choose fewer words, fewer sandals, and more time. Temples that once kept civic hours stand with their doors politely retired. Basilicas, Section 13, hum with creeds, Section 14. And at the edges, riverbanks, old quarries, hilltop ruins, monasteries and hermit cells begin knitting a new lace along the empire's hems. Walk first to reuse, because Rome recycles with style. A closed shrine's marble becomes a church's ambo. A pagan bath's caldarium turns into a baptistry with acoustics that make water sound like theology. A portico becomes a zenitokaium, a guest house for strangers who arrive without letters of introduction. Mainstream anchor to steady your sandals. Across the 4th and 5th centuries, temples were frequently closed by law or attrition, their treasuries reassigned, and their structures repurposed. Spolia, reused columns, capitals, architraves, are visible in countless late antique churches, while rural shrines often faded more slowly, replaced by roadside chapels and saints' martyriums that relocated sanctity to new addresses. The map did not empty, it translated. Down by the river, an old Isis Hall, Section 7, has learned a new set of hymns. The knot survives as a grandmother's charm while the altar wears a cross and keeps its reputation for helping travelers. Up the hill, a Mithraeum, Section 8, became a storeroom, then a chapel. The benches stayed close to keep gossip from wandering. Stew was replaced by lentils with an attitude. In another quarter, a temple podium hosts a small basilica. Children run the same steps they used to climb for festivals and call this going to the saints. Light joke 1. A mason points to a Corinthian capital supporting a bishop's pulpit and claims the acanthus leaves converted first. But the biggest relocation happens beyond the walls, where hermits put distance between themselves and bakery smells. In Egypt's desert you meet Antony, old by the time you arrive, a roomer in a robe, who discovered that solitude is a crowded city if you do it right. Near him, Pachomius organizes enthusiasm into Cenobitic common life, monasteries, bells, bread, work, prayer, repeat. In Cappadocia, Basil writes rules that sound like a kindly foreman: eat, study, care for the poor, sleep, pray at hours that remember the sun's gentler habits. Later, in Italy, Benedict will distill the recipe into ora et labora with a voice that can be heard over a mill. Historians still argue whether the monastic impulse began chiefly as protest against the church grown comfortable, as continuity with earlier ascetics and philosophers, or as pastoral necessity for care networks too large for parishes alone. The ruins and the gardens answered together. Protest grew vegetables and offered them to anyone hungry. You enter a women's house and learn another grammar of courage. Widows who handled parish ledgers during persecution, Section 12, now handle orchards and orphan lists. A former deaconess teaches letters to girls who will later correct bishops' Latin with delightful precision. A handbell rings, chores exhale, psalms rise like small, regular ladders. Quirky tidbit to pin to your sleeve: monastic beehives were serious theology. Wax for candles that turn night into prayer. Honey for infirmaries. The soft diplomacy of bees that make neighbors forgive hives for being industrious near borders. Somewhere a monk in a hood whispers helpful facts about pollen and humility. At a saint's shrine you watch another relocation, from gods of place to persons whose stories now keep corners holy. The martyr's tomb, once a quiet leisure entry in a catacomb returned to the church, Section 13, has moved upstairs into a basilica's heart. Pilgrims arrive with jars and questions, leave with dust on hems and fewer questions. A rural crossroads that used to host a competum altar, Section 4, now wears a small chapel to a local confessor whose miracles mostly involve bread that lasted and rain that remembered. The empire learns to read its geography and biographies. Monasteries reshape economy with a gentleness that looks like stubbornness. Fields abandoned in war years become vineyards. Marshes learn the manners of vegetables. Scriptoria turn ink and patience into libraries that survive better than political slogans. You watch a young monk rule a page as carefully as a surveyor rules a field. The two crafts share a posture. Light joke 2. A novice asks why margins must be so wide. The librarian says, to leave room for future arguments and better penmanship. The novice nods respectfully and spills no ink for a week. What of the old gods long fade? In cities, imperial laws tighten. No sacrifices, no temple subsidies. Divination files more paperwork than it can bear. In the countryside, the Pagi give us the word paganus, villager, which later storytellers turn into pagan, the people who kept older rites where roads arrived last and bishops visited twice a year. Historians still argue whether late antique paganism ended by banned boredom, gradual demographic replacement, or strategic adoption of old forms into new festivals. The archaeology reports mosaics cleared for apses, farms keeping amulets for the evil eye, and saints moving into calendars that once hosted grain spirits. Your broom votes for attrition, habits replaced by nearly identical habits that learned a new name. In this new map, time is redistributed. Market days still happen, but monastic bells carve hours into edible pieces. Matins, lauds, prime, prayers like teaspoons of quiet stirred into labor. You tried the schedule for one afternoon and find that sweeping between psalms makes floors behave better. Your augur friend, Section 2, jokes that birds are now consulted for pleasure only. Your imperial cult treasurer, now Basilica treasurer, Section 13, audits a monastery's books and admires how goats generate both milk and line items. Sometimes the change is theatrical. The Serapeum in Alexandria falls to a mix of zeal and politics. An altar in a forum is toppled with more symbolism than structural engineering. A governor writes a letter insisting everyone calm down and turn their enthusiasm into road repair. More often it is quiet. A shrine door never opens after winter. A festival is not printed on the board. A priest retires to his sister's farm and teaches her sons to prune olives and avoid adjectives. Light joke 3. A former haruspex starts a very successful sausage shop and swears the livers are now for taste, not omens. Monks add 2 civic services the city quickly learns to count on: hospitality and listening. The guest house door opens as if that were its only hinge. Travelers find broth without interrogation. A widow with a confusing letter meets a monk who reads aloud at the speed of kindness. A soldier from the limes recognizes Mithraeum discipline, Section 8, in the refectory's silence and decides retirement will be less alarming if the bell keeps his hours. Your own feet, trained by Eleusis, Section 6, to accept seasons, find monastic time in urban mercy, regularity smuggled into bad news, mainstream fact to pocket before Vespers, from the 4th to 6th centuries, ascetic and monastic movements diversified, anchorites in Egypt and Syria, Zenobia under Pachomius and Basil, urban and suburban monasteries across the East, Benedictine houses in the Latin West, while laws under Theodosius and successors increasingly restricted public pagan rites and redirected patronage. Temples were repurposed, abandoned, or mined for building materials. Saints' cults and relic translations reoriented pilgrimage and local piety. Monastic estates became notable economic and charitable actors. By dusk, the city's soundscape has changed key. Fewer flutes practicing the 3-note melody of parades. More psalms sung at a volume that knows neighbors exist. Your lararium serpents inspect the new quiet and do not object. You still light a lamp, you still sweep the threshold. You add a monastery to your mental map the way you add a friend's house, a place to go when you are tired of being impressive. The door does not ask for incense, only for honesty. Historians still argue whether monasteries saved civilization or merely saved good habits, whether they insulated holiness from cities or taught cities to keep Sabbath in pieces, whether the fall of temples was tragedy or the end of a long compromise. You decide. The best evidence is audible, fewer arguments and bread lines, more roofs that do not leak, and a bell that remembers the sun even when clouds pretend to forget. You end the day at Compline with a handful of guests and a psalm that lands like a blanket. The reader's voice is not theatrical, it is contiguous with silence. When the last word sits, no one rushes the door. You leave slowly, as if your sandals had learned a new respect for stone, and carry home a little of the monastery's measured weather. Let the city dim until the edges loosen, porticos softening, fountains thinking in slower sentences, the day deciding it has said enough. Imagine, if you like, a small bell far away, its note traveling across roofs like a hand smoothing a crumpled sheet. You've gone a long way tonight, from kitchen shrines and household serpents to basilicas with steady columns, past altars that retired gracefully, into rooms that keep time with mercy. You can set the whole map down now. Nothing on it needs you for a while. Breathe in the things that stayed, bread that knows when to rise, water that remembers different kinds of thirst, the polite weight of a door closing without hurry. Breathe out the things that can rest, old arguments folded carefully like winter clothes, laws that did their work and can sleep on the shelf, schedules that will hold their shape until morning. If a few images still wander, an anchorite's lamp against a rock wall, a child running her palm along a column, bees tracing small gold ellipses in monastery air. Let them settle on the windowsill. They can keep watch with the quiet confidence of tools put away correctly. In this room, there is no altar to impress, only a table that forgives crumbs, no augury to consult, only a curtain that moves if the breeze remembers you kindly. Lengthen the lines of your breathing the way a scribe lengthens a generous margin. Count kindness as if it were inventory, a bowl, a blanket, a bell at a distance, a face you can picture smiling, which is the oldest kind of prayer. The space between sounds becomes pleasant, like the pause before a psalm's refrain, like oars lifted for one patient moment before the next stroke. When you are ready, let the last lamp burn down to a friendly ember. Morning will bring errands, and streets will remember your name. For tonight you have permission to be unimportant in the best possible way, part of a city that knows how to rest. Sleep as if the bell is keeping time for you, because somewhere it is.